Chapter 15 of One of the 28th. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. One of the 28th by G.A. Henty. Chapter 15. In Belgium. There was a general feeling of depression in the regiment when it was known that the transport had arrived in harbour. As a rule, regiments embarking for service abroad start in high spirit, and whatever private regrets are felt at parting from friends, the troops marched gaily down to the point of embarkation. But this was not the case, as the 28th, with the band at its head playing "The Girl I Left Behind Me," passed through the streets of Cork on its march down to the spot 10 miles away where the transports were lying. There was not one, from the colonel down to the youngest drummer boy, but felt that he had been deprived of the chance of taking part in a stirring campaign, and that he was going into a sort of exile. The baggage had been sent on the previous day, and the regiment, on arriving at the harbour, was speedily transferred in large lighters to the two transports. "Well, they are fine ships, anyway," Captain O'Connor said to Ralph, as the barge carrying his company approached the side of one of them. "Rather different craft to that in which we made our last voyage together. We shall have comfortable quarters on board her, and ought to make a pleasant passage if we have but decent weather." "Yes, if anything could make our voyage pleasant under the circumstances," Ralph replied dismally. "Oh, it's no use thinking any more about that," O'Connor said cheerfully. "We must make the best of matters, and hope that we shall soon be on our way back again. If not, I dare say we shall have a pleasant time in Canada. With your knowledge of French, Conway, you will make a great hit among the fair Canadians." "Oh, I didn't think of that," Ralph laughed. "Yes, the prospect is a cheering one. I promise you, O'Connor, that I will do the best I can for you. Well, here we are alongside." "Good afternoon, Captain. When are we going to sail?" O'Connor asked the master of the vessel as he stepped on deck. "You must ask the clerk of the weather," the skipper replied. "At present there is not a breath of wind stirring, and from the look of the sky I see no chance of a change at present." Day after day passed, and still the vessels remained at anchor. Not a breath of wind stirred the water, and the troops had nothing to do but to lounge idly about the decks and whistle for a breeze. Whenever a vessel came in from England, boats were lowered and rowed alongside to get the latest news. This was little enough. It was, however, known that all the powers had determined to refuse to recognize Napoleon as Emperor of France, and that a great coalition against him was being arranged. There were rumours that Belgium was likely to be the scene of operations. Already, by the terms of the late treaty, several English regiments were stationed on the Belgian border, and 3 or 4 more were already under orders to embark for that country. It was reported that Russia, Austria, and Prussia were taking steps to arm. The militia had been called out at home, and high bounties were offered for volunteers from these regiments into the line. Recruiting was going on vigorously all over the country. Horses were being bought up, and efforts made to place the attenuated regiments on a war footing. All this was tantalizing news to the 28th. The colonel was known to have written to influential friends in London, begging them to urge upon the authorities the folly of allowing a fine regiment like his to leave the country at such a moment. But little was hoped from this, for at any moment a change in the weather might place them beyond the possibility of a recall. 3 weeks passed, and then the barometer fell, and there were signs of a change. There was bustle and movement on board the ships, and even the soldiers were glad that the monotony of their imprisonment on board was about to come to an end, and their voyage to commence. The sails were loosed from their gaskets, and the sounds of the drum and fifes struck up as the capstans were manned, and the soldiers lending a hand at the bars, and the chains came clanking in at the hawse-holes. "There's a vessel coming in round the point," O'Connor said, "but we shall hardly get the last news. We shall be under way before she anchors." "She's signalling to the fort on the hill," Ralph said, as he watched the flags run up on the signal staff on the summit of Spike Island, "and they are answering down below there at the station in front of the commandant's house." A moment later a gun was fired. "That's to call our attention, I think," the skipper said, taking up his glass and directing it to the shore. "Yes, there's our number flying. Get the signal book, boy. Mr. Smith, run up the answering pennant." As soon as this ascended, the flags on shore were lowered, and a fresh set ran up. 3, 5, 0, 4. "Give me the book." "The vessels are not to sail until further orders," he read aloud. "Hooray, lads!" Captain O'Connor shouted at the top of his voice. "We're stopped until further orders." A loud cheer broke from the troops, which was echoed by a roar from the other vessel, and for a few minutes the greatest excitement reigned. The men threw their caps into the air and shouted until they were hoarse. The officers shook each other by the hand, and all were frantic with delight at the narrow escape they had had. As soon as the brig had dropped anchor, boats rowed off to her, but nothing further was learned. Just as she was leaving Plymouth, an officer had come on board with dispatches and instructions to the captain to signal immediately he arrived at Cork that if the 28th had not already sailed, they were to be stopped. Owing to the lightness of the wind, the brig had been 8 days on her passage from Plymouth. For another fortnight the regiment remained on board ship. The imprisonment was borne more patiently, now they felt sure they were not at any rate to be sent across the Atlantic. Then a vessel arrived with orders that the 28th were at once to proceed to Ostend, and 2 hours afterward the transports set sail. Belgium was hardly the spot which the troops in general would have approved of as the scene of operations, for the disastrous expedition to Walcheren was still fresh in men's minds. They would, moreover, have preferred a campaign in which they would have fought without being compelled to act with a foreign army, and would have had all the honour and glory to themselves. Still, Belgium recalled the triumphs of Marlborough, and although every mail brought news of the tremendous efforts Napoleon was making to reorganize the fighting power of France, and of the manner in which the veterans of his former wars were responding to the call, there was not a doubt of success in the minds of the 28th, from the colonel down to the youngest drummer boy. Ralph was sorry that he had not been able to pay a flying visit to his mother before his departure on active and dangerous service. He had been somewhat puzzled by her letters ever since he had been away. They had been almost entirely devoted to his doings, and had said very little about herself beyond the fact that she was in excellent health. She had answered his questions as to his various friends and acquaintances in Dover, but these references had been short, and she had said nothing about the details of her daily life, the visits she paid, and the coming in of old friends to see her. She had evidently been staying a good deal, he thought, with the Withers, and she kept him fully informed about them, although she did not mention when she went there or when she had returned. She frequently spoke about the missing will, and of her hopes it would some day be recovered, and had mentioned that the search for it was still being maintained, and that she felt confident that sooner or later it would come to light. But even as to this she gave no specific details, and he felt that, even apart from his desire to see his mother, he should greatly enjoy a long talk with her to find out everything that had been going on during his absence. Mrs. Conway had indeed abstained from giving her son the slightest inkling of the work upon which she was engaged, for she was sure he would be altogether opposed to her plan, and would be greatly disturbed and grieved at the thought of her being in any menial position. Whether, if when he returned and she had not attained the object of her search, she would let him know what she was doing, she had not decided, but she was determined that, at any rate, until he came home on leave, he should know nothing about it. "So we're going to fight Boney at last, Mr. Conway," Ralph's servant said to him. "We've never had that luck before. He's always sent his generals against us, but by jabbers he'll find that he's not got Routians and Prussians this time." "It'll be hot work, Dennis, for we shall have the best troops of France against us, and Napoleon himself in command." "It's a little weak here for the French, your honour. Didn't we beat 'em in Spain and bait 'em? Sure, they're hardly worth counting." "You'll find them fight very much better now that they have their emperor with them. You know, Wellington had all his work to beat them." "Yes, but he did beat them, your honour." "That's true enough, Dennis, but his troops now are old soldiers, most of whom have been fighting for years, while a great part of our force will be no better than militia." "They won't fight any worse for that, your honour," Dennis said confidently. "We'll beat them whenever we meet them. You'll see if we don't." "We'll certainly try anyhow, Dennis, and if all the regiments were as good as our own I should feel very sure about it. I wish, though, that we were going to fight by ourselves. We know what we can do, but we do not know how the Belgians and Dutch and Germans who will be with us can be depended upon." "The way with the Duke, I wouldn't depend on him at all, your honour. I'll just put 'em all in the rear and leave our fellows to do the work. They're miserable half-starved creatures, all of them foreigners, they tells me, and if a man's not fed, sure he can't expect him to fight. I couldn't do it myself. And I hope the Duke ain't going to put us on short rations, because it'd be murder entirely on the boys to make 'em fight with empty stomachs." "I fancy we shall be all right as to that, Dennis. I expect we shall wait quiet till the French attack us, and waiting quiet means getting plenty of food." "And decent food, I hope, your honour. Not the sort of thing they say them foreigners lives on. Dennis Mulligan could live on frogs and snails as well as another, no doubt, but it'd go sorely against me, your honour." "I don't think there's much chance of your having to live on that, Dennis. You'll get rations there just the same as you did in Spain." "What? Beef and mutton, your honour? I suppose they'll bring them across from England? Oh, they may bring some across, Dennis, but I suppose they'll be able to buy plenty for the supply of the army out here. What? Have they got cattle and sheep there, your honour? Dennis asked incredulously. Well, of course they have, Dennis, just the same as we have. The heavens! Dennis exclaimed. To think that men who can get beef and mutton should feed upon such creatures as snails and such like. It's downright flying in the face of Providence, your honour. Nonsense, Dennis. They eat beef and mutton just the same as we do. As to the frogs and snails, these are expensive luxuries, just as game is with us. There's nothing more nasty about snails, after all, than there is about oysters. And as to frogs, they were regarded as great dainties by the Romans, who certainly knew what good eating was. Sure, I'm a Roman myself, your honour. So are most of the men of the regiment. But I never heard tell of such a thing. Not that sort of Roman, Dennis, Ralph laughed. The old Romans, people who lived long before there were any popes, a people who could fight as well as any that ever lived, and who were as fond of good living as they were of fighting. Well, your honour, there's no accounting for tastes. There was Bridget Maloney, whom I courted before I entered the regiment. Well, your honour, if you'd believe it, she threw over a decent boy like me and married a little umdurman of a man about 5 feet high, and with one shoulder higher than the other. That's why I took to soldiering, your honour. No, there's no accounting for tastes, anyhow. Well, there's the mess bugle, your honour. Next time we hear it, it'll be at say, and maybe there won't be many ready to attend to it. Dennis's prediction was verified. The vessel sailed at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and by 6 was rolling heavily, and a brisk wind was blowing. The 28th had not long before made the voyage from the south of France, but they had been favoured by exceptionally fine weather, and had experienced nothing like the tossing they were now undergoing. The consequence was that only about half a dozen officers obeyed the bugle call to mess. There was a general feeling of satisfaction, though, when the low coast round Ostend was sighted, for the voyage throughout had been a rough one. Under certain circumstances a sea voyage is delightful, but confinement in a crowded transport in rough weather is the reverse of a pleasant experience. The space below decks was too small to accommodate the whole of the troops, and a third of their number had to be constantly on deck, and this for a 10 days' voyage in a heavy sea, with occasional rain showers, is not, under ordinary circumstances, calculated to raise the spirits of troops. But men bound on active and dangerous service are always in the highest spirits, and make light of disagreeables and hardships of all kinds. They had expected to find Ostend full of troops, for several regiments had landed before them, but they soon found that they were to be marched inland. As soon as the regiment had landed, they marched to a spot where a standing camp had been erected for the use of troops on their passage through. Their baggage was at once sent forward, and the men had therefore nothing to do but to clean up their arms and accoutrements, and to wander as they pleased through the town. They started early next morning, and after 2 days' march arrived at Ghent, where several regiments were quartered, either in the town itself or in the villages round it. Ralph's company had billets allotted to them in a village a mile from the town, the cottage being placed at the disposal of the captain and his 2 subalterns. The next morning, after the parade of the regiment was over, most of the officers and many of the men paid a visit to the town, where the fugitive King of France had now established his court. Ralph, who years before had read the story of Ghent, was greatly interested in the quaint old town, though it was difficult to imagine, from the appearance of its quiet streets, that its inhabitants had once been the most turbulent in Europe. Here Van Artevelde was killed, and the streets often ran with the blood of contending factions. Was it possible that the fathers of these quiet workmen in blouses, armed with axes and pikes, had defeated the chivalry of France, and all but annihilated the force of the Duke of Anjou? What a number of convents there were! The monks seemed a full third of the population, and it was curious to hear everyone talking in French, when the French were the enemy that they were going to meet. The populace were quite as interested in their English visitors as the latter were with them. The English scarlet was altogether strange to them, and the dress of the men of the Highland regiment, who were in camp next to the 28th, filled them with astonishment. For a fortnight the regiment remained at Ghent, and then they, with some others of the same division, marched to Brussels and took up their quarters in villages round that town. The 28th belonged to Picton's division, which formed part of the reserve concentrated round Brussels. The 1st Army Corps, consisting of the 2nd and 3rd Divisions of Dutch and Belgians, and the 1st and 3rd of the British, extended from Enghien on to the right to Quatre Bras on the left. The 1st British Division were at the former town, the 3rd between Soignies and Rout, while the Belgians and Dutch lay between Nivelles and Quatre Bras. The Second Army Corps held the ground on the right of the First, and extended to Oudenarde on the Scheldt. The cavalry, with the exception of the Brunswick Brigade, were posted at Grammont, Mons, and Reille, their outposts being thrown forward as far as Maubeuge and Beaumont. The Prussians were on the left of Wellington's force, and extended from Ligny through Namur toward Liège, their advanced posts being at Charleroi, where Zieten's division had their headquarters. But although the Allied armies thus formed together the arc of a large circle covering Brussels, they were entirely distinct. The British drew their supplies from Ostend on the right of their position, while Liège on the extreme left was the base of the Prussians. Napoleon's movements were uncertain. He might either advance upon Namur and cut off the Prussians from their base, or between Grammont and Oudenarde, by which measure he would similarly cut the British off from Ostend, or he might advance from Charleroi direct upon Brussels, breaking through at the point where the Wellington's left joined the Prussian right. The Duke of Wellington believed that he would attempt the second of these alternatives, as in that case he would fall upon the British before the Prussians could come up to their assistance, and if successful would not only cut them off from the base of supplies, but would be able to march straight upon Brussels. It was to defeat this plan that the Duke posted the largest portion of his British troops along the frontier, holding, however, 2 British divisions and the Brunswick and Nassau troops in and round Brussels, where they were nearly equidistant from any point that could be attacked, and could be moved forward as soon as the enemy's intentions became manifest. By the time that the whole of the forces were assembled, Wellington had 90,000 men under his orders. Blücher, the Prussian general, had 116,000, while Napoleon had 125,000 with which to encounter this vastly superior force. Upon the other hand, Napoleon's were all veteran troops, and the French had for a long time been accustomed to victory over the Prussians. Of Wellington's force, fully half were of mixed nationalities, Belgians, Dutch, Brunswickers, and Hessians, while his British division consisted chiefly of young troops, so hastily raised that a great number of them absolutely fought at Waterloo in the uniforms of the militia regiments from which they had been drafted. It seemed, however, a well-nigh desperate enterprise for Napoleon to attack so greatly superior a force, but he had in fact no choice but to do so, for Russia and Austria were arming, and their forces would soon be advancing upon France, and it was therefore necessary, if possible, to defeat the British and Prussians before they could arrive. Could he succeed in doing this, the enthusiasm that would be excited in France would enable him vastly to increase his army. In the meantime, his confidence in his own military genius was unbounded, and the history of his past was contained many triumphs won under circumstances far less favourable than the present. During the weeks that elapsed while the 3 great armies were assembling and taking up their positions, the troops stationed round Brussels had a pleasant time of it. The city itself was crowded with visitors. Here were a number of the wives and friends of the officers of the various armies. Here were many of the French nobility, who had abandoned France upon the landing of Napoleon. Here were numbers of people attracted by curiosity, or the desire of being present at the theatre of great events, together with a crowd of simple pleasure-seekers. For Europe had for many years been closed to Englishmen, and as soon as peace had been proclaimed, great numbers had crossed the Channel to visit Paris, and had travelled in Germany, Italy, and, of course, to Switzerland. The news of Napoleon's return to France had occasioned a great scare among the tourists. A very few days sufficed for the desertion of Paris and other French towns, and so great was the crowd that the packet boats between Calais and Dover were insufficient to carry them. Many of the visitors to Paris, instead of leaving for England, made for Belgium, and were joined there by travellers hurrying back from Austria, Germany, and other parts of Europe, for none could say what course the events that would follow Napoleon's return from Elba might take. At Brussels, however, they felt safe. The distance to England was short, and they could, if necessary, leave at any time. Besides, between Belgium and France, 12,000 British troops had been stationed in the strong places, in accordance with the terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau and an agreement made with her allies after the fall of Napoleon. The streets of Brussels were ablaze with bright colours. Staff officers in the uniforms of a number of nationalities dashed through the streets, followed by their orderlies. Now and then 2 or 3 general officers, riding at a slower pace and engaged in earnest talk, passed along, while the pavements were occupied by crowds of men and officers in all the varieties of British, Dutch, Belgian, Brunswick, Hanoverian, Hessian, and Prussian uniforms. Although Belgium had cast her lot with the Allies, the people were by no means unanimous in their sympathies, and indeed the majority, from their similarity both in religion and tongue to the French, sympathized with them rather than with the Allies, who were for the most part both Protestants and foreigners. Those who entertained these sentiments, however, kept them to themselves, while the rest fraternized to the best of their power with the troops, many of whom were quartered in the town. As for amusements, there were for the officers the theatres and an opera, while many of the ladies staying in Brussels kept almost open houses. Races and athletic sports were got up for the men. The weather at the latter end of May and during the early days of June was delightful, and although all knew that the storm might at any moment burst, it was difficult to believe, while so enjoying themselves, that tomorrow they might be called upon to meet the enemy in deadly conflict. Even Dennis Mulligan had nothing to complain about in his rations, and allowed to Ralph that the Belgians were much more decent people than he'd expected to find them. The months of April and May had passed quietly on the frontier. The cavalry of the Allied army on one side and the French mounted gendarmerie on the other maintained a vigilant watch over each other's movements, and each endeavoured to prevent the passing out of persons who might carry news of the intentions and position of their armies. But the line was far too long to be strictly watched, and French loyalists on the one side and Belgian sympathizers with France on the other managed to pass with sufficient regularity to keep the generals informed of the movements of their opponents. Wellington then was perfectly aware of the gathering of Napoleon's forces upon the other side of the frontier, but they, like his own troops, were scattered over a long front, and yet there was no indication whatever as to the point where Napoleon was likely to break through. During the past 3 months large bodies of men had laboured to restore the ruined fortifications of the frontier towns. The moats had been cleared out and deepened, the walls repaired and the sluices restored, so that in case of necessity a wide tract of country could be laid under water. These precautions had been especially taken on the right of the British position, where Wellington expected Napoleon's attack, and the general calculated that, with the aid of the obstacles so interposed to Napoleon's advance, the troops stationed there would be able to check the tide of invasion until the whole army arrived to their assistance. The country between Brussels and the frontier was reconnoitred, and engineer officers were employed in making sketches of all the positions that appeared likely to offer special advantages as battlefields for an army standing on the defence. Among others, the fields lying in front of the village of Waterloo were mapped, and the spot was specially marked by the Duke as one to be occupied in case the enemy forced a way between the British and Prussian armies. On the 12th of June the Duke of Wellington learned that Napoleon and the Guards had left Paris for the north, and the next day the officer in command of the cavalry outposts reported that the pickets of French cavalry which had so long faced him had disappeared, and that he had learned from some French custom house officers that hostilities were about to commence. On the 15th of June Ralph Conway had gone with Stapleton into Brussels as usual. Everything was going on with its accustomed regularity. A military band was playing in the park. Numbers of well-appointed carriages filled with well-dressed ladies drove to and fro, and crowds of officers and civilians strolled under the trees, greeting their acquaintances and discussing the latest gossip of the town. As to the coming of the French, the topic was so threadbare that no one alluded to it, and no stranger could have imagined from the aspect of the scene that 3 great armies were lying 30 or 40 miles away in readiness to engage at any moment in a desperate struggle. The great subject of talk was the ball that was to be given that evening by the Duchess of Richmond. This was expected altogether to outshine any of the other festivities that had taken place in Brussels during that gay season. It was about 4:30 in the afternoon when the young men saw Captain O'Connor approaching. "Can you young fellows keep a secret?" he asked. "Well, I think so," Ralph laughed. "I suppose you're both going to the ball?" "Well, of course we are. We are both off duty, and Stapleton here is quite absorbed in the thought of the conquests he intends to make." "Well, the secret is this. It's quite possible that you will not go to the ball at all." Why, how is that?" the young officers exclaimed simultaneously. Is the regiment ordered away?" "Not yet, lads, but it may be. I've just seen the colonel. He dined with the Duke at 3 o'clock. There were a lot of officers there, and the Prince of Orange, who had just come in from the outposts for the ball, told him that the Prussians at Thuin were attacked this morning, and that a heavy cannonade was going on when he left. Orders were issued half an hour ago for the whole of the troop to be in readiness to march at a moment's notice. There's no saying yet which way the French may come, and this attack upon the Prussians may be only a feint, so not a soldier can be moved till more is known. The 1st Division is ordered to collect at Ath tonight, the 3rd at Braine-le-Comte, and the 4th at Grammont. The 5th, now that's ours, with the 81st and the Hanoverian Brigade, and the 6th Division, of course collect here. All are to be in readiness to march at a moment's notice. The Prince of Orange is to gather the 2nd and 3rd Dutch Divisions at Nivelles. Of course, this first skirmish may only be intended to feel our force and positions, but at any rate it's a sign that the game is going to begin. But if the orders are issued and the troops are to collect tonight, the secret cannot be kept long. No, by this time the divisional orders will be published, and everyone will know it in an hour or two. There is really no secret about it, lads. If there had been, the Colonel wouldn't have told me, and I shouldn't have told you. See, the news is circulating already." A change was indeed taking place in the position of the scene. The loungers were gathering in little groups, talking eagerly and excitedly. The orders for the concentration of the division had become known, though as yet all were in ignorance as to the reason for their issue. The three officers joined some of the groups and listened to the talk. The general idea was that the Duke had heard that the French were gathering for an attack, and these measures were merely precautionary. It might be days yet before the affair really began. Still, it was important news, and there were pale faces among the ladies at this sudden reminder that the assembly at Brussels was not a mere holiday gathering, but that war, grim, earnest, and terrible, was impending. "We had better be getting back to our quarters," Captain O'Connor said. "Everything will have to be packed up this evening." "But does that mean that the troops are to be under arms all night?" Stapleton asked. "That it does, Stapleton. Of course they won't be kept standing in line, but when troops are ordered to be in readiness to march at a moment's notice, on such a business as this, it means that they will all be assembled. Then probably they will be allowed to lie down, and perhaps will light bivouac fires. But it means business, I can tell you." "Then I for one shan't go to the ball," Ralph said. "No doubt it will be a pretty sight, but there have been lots of balls, and this bivouac will be a new experience altogether." "Well, I don't know that you're wrong, Conway," Captain O'Connor said. "Besides, you'll probably find the colonel will issue orders that only a certain number of officers may go. I shall look in for an hour or two just to see the scene, but I don't know many people, and with a room full of generals and colonels, and 3 or 4 men to each lady, there won't be much chance of getting partners." When they reached the village, Stapleton said goodbye to them, as his company lay half a mile further on, and Captain O'Connor and Ralph entered their quarters. They found their servants busy packing up the baggage. "What is this all about, O'Connor?" Lieutenant Desmond asked. "Well, it's in orders that the whole division is to assemble tonight in readiness to march at a moment's notice. News has come that the French have attacked the Prussian outposts, and the Duke is not to be caught napping. Of course, it may be nothing but an outpost skirmish. Still, it may be the beginning of operations on a grand scale." "And there is an order," Desmond said dolefully, "that only one officer in each company is to go to the ball. You want to go, Desmond?" "Well, of course I should like to go, and so would everyone, I suppose. However, it can't be helped, for of course you will go yourself." "Well, I've made up my mind to look in for an hour or two. Conway doesn't wish to go. I'll tell you how we will arrange it, Desmond. What the order means is that 2 officers must stop with their company. It doesn't matter in the least who they are, so that there are 2 out of the 3 with the men. Dancing will begin about 8 o'clock. I'll look in there at 9. An hour will be enough for me, so I'll come back to the company, and you can slip away and stop there till it's over." "Oh, thank you very much," Desmond said gratefully. "And look here, Desmond, you'd better arrange with your man to leave your undress uniform out, so that when you get back from the ball you can slip into it and have the other packed up. At least that's what I'm going to do. I can't afford to have my best uniform spoiled by having to sleep in it in the mud. A captain's pay doesn't run to such extravagance as that." "And what will be done with the baggage if we have to march?" "Oh, I don't suppose we'll march tonight, but if we do, the quartermaster will detail a party to collect all the baggage left behind and put it in store. We needn't bother about that, especially when, for aught we know, we may never come back again to claim it." But although O'Connor did not know it, the Duke had by this time received news indicating that the attack upon the Prussian outpost was the beginning of a great movement, and that the whole French army were pressing forward by the road where the Prussian and British army joined hands. At daybreak the French had advanced in 3 columns, the right upon Châtelet, 5 miles below Charleroi and on the Sambre, the centre on Charleroi itself, the left on Marchiennes. Zieten, who was in command of the Prussian corps d'armée, defended the bridges at these points stoutly, and then contested every foot of the ground, his cavalry making frequent charges, so that at the end of the day the French had only advanced 5 miles. This stout resistance enabled Blucher to bring up 2 out of his other 3 corps. Bülow, whose corps was at Liège, 40 miles away, receiving his orders too late to march that day. The rest of the Prussian army concentrated around the villages of Fleurs and Ligny. Accordingly, at 10 o'clock in the evening, orders were issued by Wellington for the 3rd Division to march at once from Braine-le-Comte to Nivelles, for the 1st to move from Enghien to Braine-le-Comte, and for the 2nd and 4th Divisions to march from Ath to Gramont on Enghien. No fresh orders were issued to the troops round Brussels, and although it was known at the ball that the troops were in readiness to march at a moment's notice, there were none except the generals and a few members of the staff who had any idea that the movement was so near at hand. The regiments stationed at a distance from Brussels were assembled in the park by 10 o'clock that evening. Then arms were piled and the men permitted to fall out. Only a few lighted fires, for the night was warm. The artillery, however, who had all along been bivouacked in the park, had their fires going as usual, and round these many of the troops gathered, but the greater part wrapped themselves in their cloaks and went quietly to sleep. Ralph strolled about for an hour or two, chatting with other officers, and looking at the groups of sleepers, and listening to the talk of the soldiers gathered round the fires. Among them were many old peninsular men, whose experience now rendered them authorities among the younger soldiers, who listened eagerly to the details of the desperate struggle at Albuera, the terrible storming of the fortresses, and lighter tales of life and adventure in Spain. Many of the men whose quarters lay near the scene of assembly had been permitted to return to them, with strict orders to be ready to join the ranks should the bugle sound. End of Chapter 15, in Belgium. Recording by Mike Harris. Chapter 16 of 1 of the 28th. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. 1 of the 28th by G.A. Henty. Chapter 16. Found at Last. As soon as Mrs. Conway received the box, she set to work in earnest. Directly the house was still, and a sufficient time had elapsed for the Miss Penfolds to have fallen asleep, she rose from the bed on which she had lain down without undressing, put on the coat and hat, and made her way noiselessly down to the library. As she kept the lock well oiled, she entered noiselessly, and then, locking the door behind her, lighted a candle and commenced her search. On the 5th night she was rewarded by finding that the centre of what looked like a solidly carved flower in the ornamentation of the mantelpiece instead gave way under the pressure of her finger, and at the same moment she heard a slight click. Beyond this nothing was apparent, and after trying everything within reach, she came to the conclusion that it needed a second spring to be touched to reveal the entrance. It took her another 3 weeks before she found this. It was a slight projection about as large as a button in the inside of the chimney behind the mantel. Pressing this and the other spring simultaneously, the bookcase on the left of the fireplace suddenly swung open 3 or 4 inches. For a moment she stood breathless with excitement, hesitating before she entered. Then she swung the bookcase open. There, as she had expected, was a little room 7 feet long by 4 feet deep, but to her bitter disappointment it was bare and empty. A few scraps of paper lay on the ground, but there was no furniture, chest, or boxes in the room. The revulsion was so great that Mrs. Conway returned into the library, threw herself into a chair, and had a long cry. Then she went back into the room and carefully examined the pieces of paper lying on the ground. One of them was a portion of a letter, and she recognized at once the handwriting of Mr. Talboys. It contained only the words, "My dear Mr. Penfold, in accordance with your request I send you the..." But above was the date, which was 10 days only anterior to Mr. Penfold's death. Mrs. Conway had no doubt that the word that should have followed the fragment was "will," and that this was the letter that Mr. Talboys had sent over with that document. It was important evidence, as it showed that Mr. Penfold had been in the habit of using this place during his lifetime, and that he had entered it after he had received the will from his solicitor a few days before his death. Why should he have entered it, except to put the will in a place of security? Where that place was she did not know, but she felt certain that it was somewhere within reach of her hand. "If it is here, it must be found," she said resolutely. "But I won't begin to look for it tonight. It must be 3 o'clock already, and I'll think the matter over thoroughly before I begin again. It's something to have found out as much as I have. I ought to be encouraged instead of being disappointed." That day she wrote to Mr. Tallboys, giving him a full account of the discovery which she had made, and enclosing the fragment of his letter. She did not renew her search for the next 2 nights, for her long watchfulness and excitement had told upon her, and she felt that she needed rest before she set about the second part of the search. She received a letter from Mr. Tallboys in reply to that she had sent him. "My dear Mrs. Conway, I congratulate you most heartily upon the great success you have met with. I own that I have never been very hopeful, but after the thorough search we made of the room I hardly thought it likely that you would succeed when we had failed. However, you have done so, and I cannot doubt that a similar success will attend your further efforts. In a small bare room such as you describe, the difficulties in the way of finding the hidden receptacle cannot be so great as though you have already overcome. You are perfectly correct in your supposition that the fragment you sent me was part of the letter that I sent over with the will to Mr. Penfold by my clerk. I have compared it with the copy in my letter book, and find that it is the same. As you say, this letter proves conclusively that Mr. Penfold was in this secret room after he received the will, and one can assign no reason for his going there unless to put the will away in what he considered a secure hiding place. That it is still somewhere there I have no doubt whatever, and I shall await with much anxiety news as to your further progress." Thinking the matter over, Mrs. Conway had come to the conclusion that the hiding place could only be under one of the stone flags of the floor, or in the wall against the fireplace, or rather in that part of it above the fireplace. There would not be thickness enough in the walls separating the secret chamber from the passage, or the rooms on either side of it. But the chimney would not be of the same width as the open fireplace below, and there might well be a space there sufficient for a good-sized closet. It was here, therefore, that she determined to begin her search. The next night, then, after touching the springs and entering the secret chamber, she began carefully to examine each stone in the wall next to the fireplace at a distance of about 4 feet above the ground. In 5 minutes she uttered an exclamation of satisfaction. One of the stones, above 18 inches square, although like the rest fitting closely to those adjoining it, was not, like the others, bedded in cement. So close was the join that it needed a close inspection to see that it was different from those around it. Still, upon close examination, it was evident that it was not cemented in. Taking out a penknife from her pocket, she found that the joint was too close even to allow this to be inserted for any distance. There was no keyhole or any other visible means of opening it, and she searched the walls in vain for any hidden spring. For a whole week she continued the search, but without the slightest success, and at last began almost to despair, for at the end of that time she was convinced that she had passed her fingers again and again over every square inch of the floor and walls within her reach. Completely worn out with her sleepless nights, she determined to take a little rest, and to abstain altogether for a few nights from the search. On the third night, however, an idea suddenly occurred to her. She rose at once, dressed herself, and was about to go downstairs, when she thought she heard a noise below. She returned at once to her room, hid away her hat and coat, and again went to the top of the stairs and listened. Yes, she had not been mistaken. She distinctly heard sounds below, and she thought the murmur of men's voices. After a moment's thought she returned to her room, took off her dress, and threw a shawl round her shoulders, and then stole quietly down the stairs to the next floor and knocked gently at Miss Penfold's door. She repeated the knock 2 or 3 times, and then heard Miss Penfold's voice asking who was there. She did not speak, but knocked again. This time the voice came from the other side of the door. "It's me, Miss Penfold. Anna Sibthorpe." The door was unlocked and opened. "What is it, Anna?" "There is someone in the house, ma'am. I can hear them moving about down below, and I think I can hear men's voices." Miss Penfold came out and listened. "Yes, there is someone there," she said. "Go and call the butler and the others. I shall be ready by the time you come down." In 2 or 3 minutes the servants, headed by the butler, who had armed himself with a blunderbuss that always hung in his room ready for action, came downstairs. Miss Penfold came out to meet them, half dressed. She had a pistol in her hand. The maids had armed themselves with pokers and brooms. "Have you looked at the priming of your blunderbuss?" Miss Penfold asked quietly. "No, ma'am." "Well, then, look now," she said sharply. "What's the use of having a weapon if you don't see that it's in order?" "Oh, it's all right, ma'am," the butler said, examining the priming. "Well, then, come along and don't make a noise." They went downstairs noiselessly and paused when they reached the hall. The sounds came from the drawing-room. Miss Penfold led the way to the door, turned the handle, and flung it open. 3 men were seen in the act of packing up some of the valuables. They started up with an exclamation. Miss Penfold fired, and there was a cry of pain. A moment later there was a roar as the blunderbuss went off, the contents lodging in the ceiling. Without hesitating for a moment, the 3 men made a rush to the open window and were gone. "John Wilton," Miss Penfold said sternly, "you are a fool. I give you a month's notice from today. Fasten up the shutters again, and all go off to bed." And without another word she turned and went upstairs. As she reached the landing, her sister ran out of her room in great alarm. "Oh, what is the matter, Charlotte? I heard 2 explosions." "It is nothing, Eleanor. Some men broke into the house, and we have gone down and frightened them away. I did not think it was worth while disturbing you, as you are so easily alarmed. But it is all over now, and the servants are shutting up the house again. I will tell you all about it in the morning. Go to bed again at once, or you will catch cold. Good night." Directly Miss Penfold had gone upstairs, a hubbub of talk burst out from the female servants. "It's disgraceful, John. With that great gun you ought to have shot them all dead." "It went off by itself," John said, "just as I was going to level it." "Went off by itself?" the cook said scornfully. "It never went off of itself when it was hanging above your bed. Guns never go off by themselves, no more than girls do. I'm surprised at you, John. Why, I have heard you talk a score of times of what you'd do if burglars came, and now here you've been and knocked a big hole in the ceiling. Why, missus has 20 times as much courage as you have. She shot straight, she did, for I heard one of the men give a squawk. Ha! You men are pitiful creatures, after all." "You wouldn't have been so mighty brave, cook, if Miss Penfold and me hadn't been in front of you." "A lot of use you were," the cook retorted. 6 feet 1 of flesh and no heart in it. Why, I would have knocked him down with a broom if I'd been within reach of him." "Yes, that we would, cook," the under-housemaid said. "I had got my poker ready, and I would have given it to them nicely if I could have gotten within reach. Miss Penfold was just as cool as if she'd been eating her breakfast, and so was we all, except John." John had by this time fastened up the shutter again, and feeling that his persecutors were too many for him, he slunk off at once to his room, and the others, beginning to feel that their garments were scarcely fitted for the cold night air, postponed their discussion of the affair until the following morning. The next morning after breakfast the servants were called into the dining-room, and Miss Penfold interrogated them closely as to whether any of them had seen strange men about, or had been questioned by anyone they knew as to valuables at the Hall. "If it had not been for Anna," she said, when she had finished without eliciting any information, "the house would have been robbed, and not any of us would have been any the wiser. It was most fortunate that, as she says, she happened to be awake and heard the sounds, and she acted very properly in coming quietly down to wake me. If the one man in the house," and she looked scornfully at the unfortunate butler, "had been possessed of the courage of a man, the whole of them would have been shot, for they were standing close together, and he could hardly have missed them if he had tried. If that weapon had been in the hands of Anna instead of those of John Wilton, the results would have been very different. However, John Wilton, you have been a good servant generally, and I suppose it's not your fault if you have not the courage of a mouse. Therefore I shall withdraw my notice for you to leave. I shall make arrangements for the gardener to sleep in the house in future, and you will hand that blunderbuss over to him. I shall write today to the ironmonger at Weymouth to come over and fix bells to all the shutters, and to arrange wires for a bell from my room to that which the gardener will occupy." At breakfast Miss Penfold informed her sister of what had taken place the night before. "I shall write, of course, to the head constable at Weymouth to send over to inquire about it, but I have very little hope that he will discover anything, Eleanor." "Oh, why do you think that, Charlotte? You said that you were convinced you had wounded one of the men, so they ought to be able to trace him." "Oh, I dare say they would if this had been an ordinary theft, but I'm convinced that it was not." "Not an ordinary theft? What do you mean?" "I have no doubt in my mind, Eleanor, that it was another attempt to discover the will." "Do you think so?" Eleanor said in an awed voice. That's terrible. But you said the men were engaged in packing up the candlesticks and ornaments." "Oh, I believe that was a mere blind. Of course they would wish us to believe they were simply burglars, and therefore they acted as much to begin with. But there has never been any attempt on the house during the 40 years we have lived here. Why should there be so now? If Anna had not fortunately heard those men, I believe that When they had packed up a few things to give the idea that they were burglars, they would have gone to the library and set to ransack it and find the will." But they would never have found it, Charlotte. It's too well hidden for that." "There is no knowing," Miss Penfold said gloomily. "So long as it is in existence we shall never feel comfortable. It will be much better to destroy it." "No, no," Eleanor exclaimed. "We agreed, Charlotte, that there was no reason why we should assist them to find it, but that it is altogether a different thing from destroying it. I should never feel happy again if we did." "As for that," Miss Penfold said somewhat scornfully, "you don't seem very happy now. You're always fretting and fidgeting over it." "It is not I who am fancying that these burglars came after the will," Eleanor answered in an aggrieved voice. "No, that is the way with timid people," Miss Penfold said. "They are often afraid of shadows, and see no danger where danger really exists. At any rate, I am determined to see whether the will really is where we suppose it to be. If it is, I shall take it out and hide it in the mattress of my bed. We know that certainly that it will be safe there, at any rate as long as I live, though I do think it's wiser to destroy it." "No, no," Eleanor exclaimed, "anything but that. I sleep badly enough now, and I am always dreaming that Herbert is standing by my bedside with a reproachful look upon his face. I should never dare sleep at all if we were to destroy it." "I have no patience with such childish fancies, as I told you over and over again," Miss Penfold said sharply. "If I am ready to take the risk of doing it, I do not see that you need fret about it. However, I am ready to give in to your prejudices, and indeed would rather not destroy it myself if it can be safely kept elsewhere. At any rate, I shall move it from its hiding place. We know that it is there and nowhere else that it will be searched for, and with it in my room we need have no more uneasiness. I can unsew the straw palliasse at the bottom of my bed, and when it's safely in there I shall have no fear whatsoever." "Well, of course you can do as you like, Charlotte," Eleanor said feebly, "but for my part I would much rather go on as we are. We don't know now that the will really exists, and I would much rather go on thinking that there is a doubt about it." "Very well, then, go on so, Eleanor. You need ask no questions of me, and I shall tell you nothing. Only remember, if I die before you, don't part with the palliasse on my bed." Mrs. Conway thought a good deal during the day about the events of the night before, and determined to be more cautious than ever in her operations, for she thought it probable that Miss Penfold would be even more wakeful and suspicious than before. She would have left the search alone for a few days had it not been for the idea that had taken her from her bed the night before. It had struck her then as possible that the spring opening the secret closet might be in the chimney behind it, and that it was necessary to touch this from the outside before opening the door of the secret room. She was convinced that had there been a spring in the room itself she must have discovered it, but it never before struck her that it might be at the back of the closet. She felt that she must satisfy herself on this point, whatever the risk of discovery. Accordingly, at the usual hour, she made her way downstairs. She had put the key in the door, and was in the act of turning it when she heard a noise upstairs. She opened the door and stood looking up the stairs. In a moment she saw a light, and directly afterward Miss Penfold appeared at the top, holding a candle in her hand. Knowing she was as yet unseen, Mrs. Conway entered the library and closed the door behind her. Then she hurried to the fireplace, touched the two springs, pulled the bookcase open, and entered the secret chamber, and closed the bookcase behind her. She had often examined the lock, thinking that the secret spring of the closet might be concealed there. It was a large, old-fashioned one, and moved two bolts, one at the top of the door and one at the bottom. These, she had already discovered, could be easily opened from the inside. She imagined that Miss Penfold was merely going round the house to see that all was secure, and she had, contrary to her practice, taken the key from the door of the library in order that Miss Penfold might enter it if she chose. But the thought now flashed across her that possibly she might intend to open the secret room, and to prevent this she now thrust the barrel of the pistol she carried in between the back of the bolt and the piece of iron against which it shot, so that the action of the springs could not throw it out of its place. Breathlessly she listened. Presently she heard a sharp click in the wall behind her. She had scarcely time to wonder what this meant when she heard a sound in the lock close to her. It was repeated again and again. Then she felt a slight tremor of the door, as if somebody was trying to shake it. Her heart almost stood still. Miss Penfold was evidently trying to open the chamber, and, though she knew the lock could not open as long as she held the pistol in the place, she felt her breath coming fast and her heart beating. For 5 minutes the attempts to open the door continued. Then all was still again. For half an hour she remained without moving. Then, as all continued quiet, she guessed that Miss Penfold, finding the springs did not act, had returned to her room. She now rose to her feet, drew out her dark lantern, and turned to the wall by her side. She gave an exclamation of joy. The stone that she had so long vainly endeavoured to move was swung open. Miss Penfold, who of course had the secret, had touched the spring outside before attempting to open the chamber, and the stone, which was set in iron, had swung open on a hinge. In a moment Mrs. Conway explored the contents. The closet was about 2 feet square by 9 inches in depth, and contained 2 shelves. There were several papers in it, and the very first upon which she placed her hand was marked, "The Last Will and Testament of Herbert Penfold." So overwhelmed was Mrs. Conway at this termination of her long search that she sank to the ground, and it was some time before she could collect herself sufficiently to consider what was her best course. It was evident that for some reason Miss Penfold had been about to visit the secret room to see that the will was still in safety. The failure of the springs to act had of course disconcerted her, but she might try again in the morning, and would then be able to enter the room, and would discover that the will was missing. It was clearly the best course to make off at once. She remembered now that she had noticed a tiny hole no bigger than a nail hole in the door, and had found that upon the other side it was just above a row of books in the shelves, somewhat lower in height than the rest, and was evidently intended to enable the occupant of the chamber to obtain a view of the library, and see whether that room was occupied. She applied her eye to it at once, and saw that all was dark. Concealing the lantern again beneath her coat, she drew back the bolts gently and stepped out. Then she went to one of the windows, took down the bell, carefully unbarred the shutters, threw up the window, and stepped out. She sped across the garden, down the drive, and through the gate, and then hurried at the top of her speed toward the village. She had gone about half the distance when she heard a horse's footsteps approaching. The road ran between 2 high hedges, and there was no place for concealment. She therefore walked along by the edge of the road close to the hedge, hoping that the horseman would pass without noticing her. His eyes, however, were too much accustomed to the darkness. He reined in his horse when he came to her, and a moment later the light of a small lantern fell on her face. "Who are you?" a voice asked, "and where are you going?" "I am going to the vicarage," she said, "to see Mr. Withers." "A likely story that," he said. "What is this, a woman with a man's hat and coat? There's something wrong here." And leaning down he caught her by the collar. She saw by the light of his lantern that he was a mounted patrol. "It's quite true, Constable," she said. "I have put these things on in a hurry, but I am going to see Mr. Withers on a question of life and death. Take me to the vicarage, and if when you get there you find my story is not true, you can lock me up if you like." The constable was puzzled. The voice was apparently that of a lady, and yet her attire and her presence abroad at 2 o'clock in the morning was suspicious in the extreme. He paused, irresolute. "Oh, I don't like to disturb the vicar at this time of night," he said. "I'll take you to the village lock-up and go up to him in the morning." "Oh, please, please don't do that," she said. "I am a lady, and have a very good reason for what I am doing. I can promise you that Mr. Withers will not be angry at being called up. Indeed, he will be greatly pleased. Come, Constable," she went on, seeing that he hesitated. "I'll give you a couple of guineas to take me direct to the vicarage." "Well, ma'am," the constable said, "if you're sure Mr. Withers will not be angry at being called upon at such an hour, I will take you. But you know he's a magistrate, and it would never do to play tricks upon him." "There are no tricks, Constable. He knows me very well, and will be pleased to see me even at this hour." Greatly puzzled over the whole proceeding, the constable turned and, still keeping a firm hold of her collar, walked his horse back toward the village. "You really need not hold me so tightly," Miss Conway said. "If I wanted to get away I could have done so in a moment, for I have a pistol in my pocket and could have shot you at the moment you turned your lantern away from me." Somewhat startled at this information, the constable released his hold, satisfied that his prisoner could not escape by speed. As a measure of precaution he made her walk a pace or two ahead, and kept the light of his lantern upon her while he held his pistol ready for action in his hand, in case she should suddenly turn upon him. They went through the village, and 5 minutes afterward entered the gate of the vicarage. On reaching the door, Mrs. Conway rang the bell. A moment later a window above opened. "What is it?" a man's voice asked. "Am I wanted anywhere?" "I am the mounted patrol, sir," the constable said, "and I've met a suspicious sort of person in the road. She said she was coming to you, and you knew her, and though it didn't seem a likely sort of story, I thought it better to run the risk of disturbing you instead of taking her to the lock-up." "It is I, Mr. Withers," Mrs. Conway said, taking off her hat and stepping out so that the light of the policeman's lantern fell upon her. "Please let me in. I have got it." "Good heavens!" Mr. Withers exclaimed, startled out of his usual tranquillity. It's all right, constable. I'll be down in a minute." "There, constable, you see I spoke truly," Mrs. Conway said, and taking her purse from her pocket, she extracted by the light of the lantern 2 guineas and handed them to the man. "Oh, I don't want to take your money, ma'am," he said apologetically. "You must excuse me not believing you, but it did seem a rum start." "You are quite right, constable," she replied. "The circumstances were suspicious, and you only did your duty. However, you might have made it very unpleasant for me if you had chosen to take me to the lock-up instead of bringing me here, and I am very willing to give you what I promised you. I can afford it very well," she said cheerfully, as he still hesitated, "and I dare say it will be useful to you." In the end the man took the money and touched his hat, and sat quiet until the door opened, and Mr. Withers, in a dressing gown and holding a candle, appeared. "You've done quite right in bringing the lady up here," Mr. Withers said, "but you need not go talking about it in the village." "Very well, sir. I'll say nothing about it. Good night, sir. Good night, ma'am." "My dear Mrs. Conway, what has happened to bring you here at this hour of the night?" Mr. Withers asked as he closed the door behind. "Did I understand you to say that you have got it? Is it possible that you have found the will?" "Quite possible, Mr. Withers. Here it is in its envelope with the seals unbroken." "You astonish me," Mr. Withers explained. At this moment Mrs. Withers made her appearance at the top of the stairs, her husband having briefly said as he hurried out of the room that it was Mrs. Conway. "Amy," he said, "here is Mrs. Conway, and what do you think? She has brought the missing will with her." With an exclamation Mrs. Withers ran downstairs and threw her arms around Mrs. Conway. "You dear brave creature," she said, "I have been longing to speak to you for the last 6 months. It seemed so unnatural, your being close to us and my not being able to see you. And you have really found the will? I can hardly believe it. How has it all come about?" "Oh, don't bother her, Amy," Mr. Withers said. For now that the excitement was past, Mrs. Conway was trembling all over and was scarcely able to keep her feet. "She is overtired and overexcited. Take her straight up to the spare room and get her to bed. I'll make her a tumbler of hot port wine and water. The water is sure to be warm in the kitchen, and a stick or two will make it boil by the time she's ready for it. We'll hear all about it in the morning. We have got the will safe, and we have got her, and that is quite enough for us for tonight. All the rest will keep very well until tomorrow." In a few minutes Mrs. Conway was in bed, and after drinking the tumbler of hot negus Mr. Withers had prepared for her, she soon fell asleep. Mrs. Withers came into the room early in the morning. "My husband says you are not to think of getting up unless you feel quite equal to it, and I agree with him. So if you like I will bring breakfast up to you, and then you can go off to sleep again for a bit." "Oh no, thank you," Mrs. Conway replied. "Now that I am fairly awake and realize where I am perfectly ready to get up. I could not think the first moment I opened my eyes where I had got to, and fancied I had overslept myself and should get a nice scolding." "You must wear one of my dresses, my dear," the vicar's wife said. "You have done with that servant's gown for good. I'll bring you one in a few moments." In half an hour Mrs. Conway came down in a pretty morning dress of Mrs. Withers. Mabel had that moment made her appearance in the breakfast room. She had returned only a week before from her stay at Bath, having positively mutinied against the proposal that she should stay there for another 6 months. She started at the entry of a stranger. "Don't you know me, Mabel?" Mrs. Conway said, holding out her hand. Why, Mabel exclaimed, it's Mrs. Conway. When did you come, and what have you been doing to yourself? Why, your hair is quite a different colour. What does it all mean, Mamma?" she asked in bewilderment. "Mrs. Conway came last night, Mabel, after you were in bed." "But you didn't tell me she was coming, Mamma." "Well, we didn't know ourselves, dear. She arrived quite unexpectedly." And Mabel stopped. "And I have got on one of your mamma's dresses," Mrs. Conway laughed, interpreting Mabel's look of surprise. "Yes, dear, and as you say, I have dyed my hair. But why, Mrs. Conway? It was such a pretty colour before." "And it will be again some day, I hope, for I am not going to dye it any more." "Oh, I am glad of that," Mabel said frankly, "for you look quite different somehow. But why did you do it? And why... Is there anything the matter, Mrs. Conway?" she broke off suddenly, "that you came here without being expected, and are wearing one of Mamma's dresses, and have dyed your hair, and look so different altogether? Have you heard anything about Ralph?" "You'll hear all about it presently, Mabel," Mr. Withers, who had just come into the room, said. "You owe a great debt of gratitude to Mrs. Conway, as you will hear presently, for she has for 6 months been working in the interest of Ralph and you. Now, don't open your eyes so wide, but sit down at the table. After we've had breakfast, Mrs. Conway will tell us all about it. By the way, Mrs. Conway, have you heard the news?" "What news, Mrs. Withers?" "In the newspaper I got yesterday evening it was said that a dispatch had just been received from the Duke of Wellington, saying he had news that Bonaparte was advancing, and that he had just issued orders for the troops to march forward to support the Prussians, who were likely to be first attacked." "No, I had heard nothing about it," Mrs. Conway said, turning pale. "Then there is going to be a battle, and Ralph will be engaged." "You must not alarm yourself," the vicar said. "You know the troops are very widely scattered, and his regiment may not be up in time. Besides, you see, the Prussians are likely to be first attacked, and they may beat the French before the English get up to join in the battle." "Now, Mrs. Conway," Mr. Withers said when they had finished breakfast, "please take pity on us and tell us all about it." "Is Mabel to go away, or is she to hear it all, James?" Mrs. Withers asked. "What do you think, Mrs. Conway?" "I see no reason whatever against her hearing. Mabel is fast growing up. You're past 15 now, are you not, Mabel?" "Yes, Mrs. Conway." "Then I think she has a right to hear all about it. She is, after all, a party most interested." "Thank you, Mrs. Conway," the girl said. "Please let us go out into the garden and sit in the chairs under the shade of that tree. I can see it's going to be a long story, and it will be delightful out there, and then papa can smoke his after breakfast cigar." "Very well, Mabel, if your mamma has no objection, I'm quite willing." The chairs were taken out into the shade of the tree, and the party sat down, Mabel all excitement, for as yet she knew nothing whatever of what had happened, and was puzzling herself in vain as to how Mrs. Conway could have worked in her interest. "In the first place, Mabel," Mrs. Conway began, "I suppose you have no idea why you were sent away to Bath?" Mabel opened her eyes in surprise. "Well, I thought I went there to get lessons in music and French and dancing." "Well, you did go for that purpose, but for something else also. You were sent away in order that you might not see me." "Not see you, Mrs. Conway? Why, you must be joking. Why, papa, what reason could there possibly be why I should not see Mrs. Conway? And besides, you never told me in your letter that she'd been here." "Well, I have not been here, at least not in this house, but I was in the church every Sunday. I was there before you went away, although you did not see me. I was sitting in the pew with the hall servants." "With the hall servants?" Mabel repeated in astonishment. "What did you sit with them for, and where were you staying, and why did you come to church every Sunday and not come here?" "That's just the story you're going to hear, Mabel. You heard, of course, that it was Mr. Penfold's intention to leave you half his estate." "Oh, yes, I heard that, and then there was no will found, so of course I didn't get it." "No, my dear, but as we all believed that there was such a will, we were naturally unwilling to let the matter rest. Still, the chance of finding it seemed very remote. You remember we spoke to you about it when they offered you that 100 a year." "Yes, papa, you told me that you thought they were keeping me out of my rights, and that was why I ought to refuse it. Yes, you did say they were keeping Ralph out too, and that was partly why you thought I ought not to agree to take the money, and of course I thought so too, because that would seem as if we had deserted Ralph." "Well, Mabel, at that time the chance of our ever hearing anything of the will was so remote that I think both your mother and myself had entirely given up hope, and I am sure we should never have taken any more steps in the matter. Fortunately, Mrs. Conway possesses a great deal more energy and perseverance than we have, and when she found that we gave it up, and that Mr. Tallboys gave it up, she determined to take the matter in her own hands. Now she will tell us how she succeeded, and you must listen quietly and not ask any more questions than you can help till she's finished." "Well, my dear," Mrs. Conway went on, "Mr. Tallboys, Mr. Penfold's lawyer, did everything he possibly could to find the will, but he could not do so, and as my son was with you, the person that had been robbed, I thought it was my duty to undertake the search myself." Mrs. Conway then related step by step the measures she had taken to obtain a situation as servant at the Hall, and then went on to tell the manner in which she had carried on the search, and how success had finally crowned her efforts, her story being frequently interrupted by exclamations and questions from her hearers. "What do you mean to do next?" Mr. Withers asked when she concluded. "I will ask you to drive me over at once to Weymouth. I shall not feel comfortable until I have placed the will in Mr. Tallboys' hands, and directly I have done that I shall go over to Brussels. I may perhaps get there before any great battle is fought, and I should like to see Ralph before that, if possible, and at any rate be there to nurse him if he is wounded. I shall ask Mr. Tallboys if he can spare time to go across with me to Brussels. I should not want him to stop there, but only to take me over. I should think there would be no difficulty in hiring a small vessel at Weymouth to take me to Ostend, especially as money is no object now. If Mr. Tallboys cannot spare time himself, he can send a clerk with me, or get somebody who will take me in charge. At any rate, I intend to go by myself if necessary. I do not suppose it will cause any delay about the will, Mr. Withers, for of course there must be some trouble in having it proved." "Oh, it can make no difference, Mrs. Conway. I do not give that the least thought. I will go round at once and tell William to put in the horses." "Mabel and I will go over too, James," Mrs. Withers said. "We cannot sit quiet all day after this excitement. Besides, I want to hear what Mr. Tallboys says." Mr. Withers returned in a few minutes, looking grave. "William has just come up from the village, and says that half an hour ago a man rode up from the hall with word that the doctor was to go over at once, for that Miss Eleanor Penfold had just had a stroke or a fit of some sort, and was terribly bad. I am sorry this new trouble has befallen them, but they have brought it entirely upon themselves, poor ladies. However, justice must be done, but I am sure you will agree with me, Mrs. Conway, that if the matter can possibly be arranged without exposure and publicity, it shall be done so." End of Chapter 16. Found at Last. Recording by Mike Harris. Chapter 17 of One of the 28th. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. One of the 28th by G.A. Henty. Chapter 17. Quatre Bras. At 10 o'clock, Captain O'Connor returned, and Lieutenant Desmond hurried off. "Were you sorry to leave, O'Connor?" Ralph asked that officer. "No, I was glad to get away," O'Connor replied, "knowing as I do that in another 24 hours we may be engaged, and that in 48 the greatest battle of the age may take place. It was horribly sad to look on at the scene and wonder how many of the men laughing and flirting and dancing so gaily there would be so soon lying stark and cold, how many broken hearts there would be among the women. I felt heartily glad that I had neither wife nor sweetheart there. It's not often I feel in low spirits, but for once one could not help thinking. Here it's a different thing. We're all soldiers, and whatever comes we must do our duty and take our chance. But the gaiety of that scene jarred upon me, and I could see there were many, especially the older men, who were thinking much as I did. I dare say if I had found any partners had gone in for dancing I should have thought but little about it, but standing looking on the thoughts did come. I think you were right, Conway, not to go." "Have you heard any news of what has taken place today?" "Yes, I was standing by the colonel when Picton came up to him and said, 'There's been sharp fighting on the frontier. Zieten gave the French a deal of trouble and only fell back about 6 miles. The other corps, except Boudou's, will all join them tonight. It's 1,000 pities that Zieten did not send off a mounted messenger to us directly he became engaged. If he had done so, we might have started at 1 o'clock today and should have been in line with the Prussians tomorrow. I suppose he thought Blucher would send, and Blucher thought he had sent, and so between them nothing was done, and we only got the news at 7 o'clock this evening. 9 precious hours thrown away. It's just a blunder of this sort that makes all the difference between failure and success in war. Had the message been sent, we and the Dutch divisions and the troops from Braine-le-Comte might well have been up by the morning. As it is, Blucher, with only 3 out of his 4 army corps, has the whole of the French army facing him, and must either fall back without fighting or fight against superior numbers. That is, if Napoleon throws his whole force upon him, as I suppose he will. It's enough to provoke a saint." "And what will Blucher do, do you think, General?" the colonel asked. "He sends word that he shall fight where he is, and in that case, if Napoleon throws his whole force on him, he is nearly certain to be beaten, and then we shall have Napoleon on us the next day. And now, Conway, I think it better to get a few hours' sleep if we can, for tomorrow will be a heavy day for us, unless I'm mistaken." It was some time before Ralph slept, but when he did so he slept soundly, waking up with a start as the sound of a bugle rang out in the night air. It was taken up by the bugles of the whole division, and Brussels, which had but an hour before echoed with the sound of the carriages returning from the ball, woke with a start. With the sound of the bugle was mingled that of the Highland pipes, and in a few minutes the street swarmed with the soldiers, for there was scarce a house but had either officers or men quartered in it. The upper windows were thrown up, and the inhabitants inquired the cause of the uproar, and soon the whole population were in the streets. There was no delay. The soldiers had packed their knapsacks before lying down to sleep, and in a quarter of an hour from the sound of a bugle the regiments were forming up in the park. They were surrounded by an anxious crowd. Weeping women were embracing their husbands and lovers. The inhabitants looked pale and scared, and the wildest rumours were already circulating among them. Mounted officers dashed to and fro, bugles kept on sounding the assembly, and the heavy rumble of guns was heard as the artillery came up and took up their appointed position. In half an hour from the sound of the first warning bugle the head of the column began to move, just as daylight was breaking. Comparatively few of the officers of Ralph's regiment were married men, and there were therefore fewer of those agonizing partings that wrung the hearts of many belonging to regiments that had been quartered for some time at home. But Ralph saw enough to convince him that the soldier should remain a single man, at any rate during such times as he is likely to be called upon for serious service in the field. It was a relief when the bands of the regiment struck up, and with a light step the troops marched away from the city, where they had spent so many pleasant weeks. As the troops marched on, their spirits rose, and indeed the British soldier is always at his gayest when there is a prospect of fighting. The hum of voices rose along the column, jokes were exchanged, and there was laughter and merriment. The pace was not rapid, and there were frequent stoppages, for a long column cannot march at the same pace as a single regiment, and it was 10 o'clock when they halted at Mont-Saint-Jean, 14 miles from Brussels. Here the men sat down by the roadside, opened their haversacks, and partook of a hasty meal. Suddenly there was a cheer from the rear of the column. Nearer and nearer it grew, and the regiment leaped to their feet and joined in the shout, as the Duke of Wellington, with a brilliant staff, rode forward on his way to the front. Already a booming of guns in the distance told that the troops were engaged, and there was another cheer when the order ran along the line to fall in again. Fighting had indeed begun soon after daylight. Prince Bernhard had commanded the division of Dutch troops at Quatre Bras, had commenced hostilities as soon as it was light by attacking the French in front of him, and the Prince of Orange, who had ridden to Neville's directly the ball was over, brought on the Dutch troops from that town, and joining Prince Bernhard drove back the French to within a mile of Frasnes. The Duke of Wellington reached Quatre Bras soon after 11, and finding that there was no immediate danger there, galloped away to communicate with Blucher. He found that the latter had gathered 3 of his corps and occupied a chain of low hills extending from Brie to Tongres. The rivulet of Ligny wound in front of it, and the villages of Saint-Armand and Ligny at the foot of the slope were occupied as outposts. These villages were some distance in front of the hills, and were too far off for the troops there to be readily reinforced from the army on the heights. The Duke of Wellington was of the opinion that the position was not a good one, and he is said to have remarked to Blucher, "Every man knows his own people best, but I can only say that with a British army I should not occupy this ground as you do." Had the Duke been able to concentrate his force round Quatre Bras in time, he intended to aid the Prussians by taking the offensive, but the unfortunate delay that had taken place in sending the news of the French advance on the previous evening rendered it now impossible that he should do so, and he therefore rode back to Quatre Bras to arrange for its defence against the French corps that was evidently gathering to attack it. It was well for the Allies that Napoleon was not in a position to attack in force at daybreak. His troops, instead of being concentrated the night before at Fleurus, were scattered over a considerable extent of country, and many of them were still beyond the Sambre. Marshal Ney, who had been appointed to the command of the corps, intended to push through Quatre Bras and march straight on Brussels, had only arrived that evening before, and was ignorant of the position of the various divisions under his command. Therefore it was not until 2 o'clock in the afternoon that Napoleon advanced with 60,000 men to attack the Prussians at Ligny, while at about the same hour the column under Ney advanced from Frasnes against Quatre Bras. The delay was fatal to Napoleon's plans. Had the battles commenced at daybreak, Ney could have pushed aside the defenders of Quatre Bras, and would have been at Mont Saint Jean by the time the English came up. The Prussians would have been beaten by noon instead of at dusk, and before nightfall their retreat would have been converted into a rout, and on the following day Napoleon's whole army would have been in a position to have fallen upon the only British divisions that Wellington could by that time have collected to oppose him, and would probably have been in possession of Brussels before night. Thus, while the delay in sending news to Wellington prevented the Allies from combining against the French on the 16th of June, the delay of Napoleon in attacking that morning more than counterbalanced the error. There was the less excuse for that delay inasmuch as he had himself chosen his time for fighting, and should not have advanced until he had his whole force well up and ready for action. And as the advance during the first day's fighting had been so slow, the whole army might well have been gathered at nightfall around Fleurus, ready to give battle at the first dawn of day. Fighting as he did against vastly superior forces, Napoleon's one hope of success lay in crushing the Prussians before the English, who, as he well knew, were scattered over a large extent of the country, could come up, and his failure to do so cost him his empire. The artillery fire ceased in front before the column continued its march for Mont Saint Jean. The Prince of Orange had paused in his advance when he saw how strong was the French force round Frasnes, and Ney was not yet ready to attack. Therefore, from 11 until 2 there was a cessation of operations, and the ardour of the troops flagged somewhat as they tramped along the dusty road between Mont Saint Jean and Genappe. The Prince of Orange was having an anxious time, while the British column was pressing forward to his assistance. As the hours went by, he saw the enemy's forces in front of him accumulating, while he knew that his own supports must be still some distance away. Nevertheless, he prepared to defend Quatre Bras to the last. He had with him 6,832 infantry and 16 cannon, while Ney had gathered 17,000 men and 38 guns to attack him. The latter should have had with him d'Erlon's corps of 20,000 men and 46 guns, but these were suddenly withdrawn by Napoleon when the latter found that the Prussian force was stronger than he had expected. They had just reached the field of Ligny when an order from Ney again caused them to retrace their steps to Quatre Bras, where they arrived just after the fighting there had come to an end. Thus 20,000 men with 46 guns were absolutely thrown away, while their presence with either Napoleon or Ney would have been invaluable. Soon after 2 o'clock, Picton's division, which headed the column, heard several cannon shots fired in rapid succession, and in another minute a perfect roar of artillery broke out. The battle had evidently begun, and the weary men, who had already marched over 20 miles, straightened themselves up, the pace quickened, and the division pressed eagerly forward. A few minutes later an even heavier and more continuous roar of cannon broke out away to the left. Napoleon was attacking the Prussians. The talking and laughing ceased now. Even the oldest soldiers were awed by that roar of fire, and the younger ones glanced in each other's faces to see whether others felt the same vague feeling of discomfort they themselves experienced. And yet, terrible as was evidently the conflict raging in front, each man longed to take his part in it. The officers' orders to the men to step out briskly were given in cheerful and confident voices, and the men themselves, with their fingers tightening on their muskets and their eyes looking intently forward as if they could pierce the distance and realize the scene enacted there, pressed on doggedly and determinedly. Messenger after messenger rode up to General Picton, who was marching at the head of the column, begging him to hurry on, for that the Prince of Orange was step by step being driven back. But the troops were already doing their best. The Dutch and Belgian troops had fought with considerable bravery, and had held the village of Piermont and a farm near it for some time before they fell back to the woods of Bossou. Here they made a stout stand again, but were at length driven out, and were beginning to lose heart, and in a few minutes would have given way when they saw on the long straight road behind them the red line of Picton's column. The glad news that help was at hand ran quickly through the wood, and the Belgians met their foes with fresh courage. General Picton's force consisted of the 8th and 9th British Brigades, the former under General Sir James Kempt, the latter under Sir Denis Pack. With them were the 4th Brigade of Hanoverians, with 2 batteries of artillery, the one Hanoverian, the other British. The excitement of the troops increased as they neared Quatre Bras, and a loud cheer ran along the line as they neared the wood, and took their place by the side of the hardly pressed Dutch and Belgians. Pack's brigade consisted of the 1st Battalion, 42nd, 2nd, 44th, 1st, 92nd, and 1st, 95th, while Kempt had under him the 1st, 28th, 1st, 32nd, 1st, 79th, and 3rd Royals. The aspect of the fight was speedily changed now. The French, who had been advancing with shouts of triumph, were at once hurled back, and the defenders a few minutes later were strengthened by the arrival of the greater part of the Duke of Brunswick's corps. In point of numbers, the combatants were now nearly equal, as the Allies had 18,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry, and 28 guns on the field. Of these, however, but 8,000 at most were British. Picton at once sent forward the 1st Battalion of the 95th, and these cleared a little wood in the front of Piermont of the French light troops, and restored the communication between Quatre Bras and Ligny. Ney, however, was preparing to advance again in force. His front was covered with a double hedgerow, which afforded admirable shelter to his skirmishers, while his artillery was so placed on rising ground in the rear of his position as to sweep the whole country over which his column would advance to the attack. At this moment the Duke returned from his conference with Blucher. He at once saw that the enemy had gathered a heavy column behind the woods of Bossu, and directed the Prince of Orange to withdraw the guns that were too far advanced, and to gather the Dutch and Belgian troops to oppose the advance. At the same time he sent forward the 28th to their assistance. They arrived, however, too late, for the French swept the Belgians before them and advanced steadily, while their artillery from the high ground opened a furious cannonade upon Picton's division. One of the Brunswick regiments now joined the Belgians, but in spite of this reinforcement the latter were driven from the wood of Bossu, which they had occupied when the British first came up. The British troops were suffering heavily from the artillery fire, to which their own guns could make no effectual reply. "Pretty hot this, Conway," Captain O'Connor said to Ralph. "It's not pleasant standing here being made a target of." "That it's not," Ralph said heartily. "I call it horribly unpleasant. I shouldn't mind it so much if we were doing something." It was indeed trying for young soldiers under fire for the first time. The French had got the range accurately, and every moment gaps were made in the line as the round shot ploughed through them. The officers walked backward and forward in front of their men with exhortations to stand steady. "It'll be our turn presently, lads," Captain O'Connor said assuringly. "We'll turn the tables on them by and by, never fear." It was not long to wait. Clouds of French skirmishers were seen advancing through the hedgerows and stealing behind the thickets and woods that skirted the road, and a moment later the orders came for the light companies of all the regiments of Picton's division to advance. "Forward, lads," Captain O'Connor said. "It's our turn now. Keep cool and don't waste your ammunition." With a cheer his company followed him. Every hedge, bank, and tree that could afford shelter was seized upon, and a sharp crackling fire at once replied to that of the French skirmishers. The light companies were then armed with far better weapons than those in use by the rest of the troops, and a soldier could have told at once by the sharp crackling sound along the front of the British line that it was the light companies that were engaged. But now a heavy column of troops was seen advancing from the village held by the French, and this, as it approached the part of the line held by the Brunswickers, broke up into several columns. The Germans were falling back, when the Duke sent Picton's 2 brigades to meet the enemy halfway. The 92nd were left behind in reserve on the road. The light companies were called in. Picton placed himself in front of the long line, and with a tremendous cheer this advanced to meet the heavy French columns. It was thus through the wars of the period that the English and French always fought. The French in massive column, the English in long line. Once again, as at Albuera and in many a stricken field, the line proved the conqueror. Overlapping the columns opposed to it, pouring scathing volleys upon each flank, and then charging on the shaken mass with the bayonet, the British regiments drove the enemy back beyond the hedgerows, and were with difficulty restrained from following them up the face of the opposite hill. On the right, however, the Brunswickers were suffering heavily from the cannonade of the French, and were only prevented from breaking by the coolness of their chief. The Duke of Brunswick rode backward and forward in front of them, smoking his pipe and chatting cheerfully with his officers, seemingly unconscious of the storm of fire, and even the most nervous of his young troops felt ashamed to show signs of faltering when their commander-in-chief set them such an example. 4 guns, which at his request Wellington had sent to him, came up and opened fire, but so completely were they overmatched that in 5 minutes 2 were disabled and the other 2 silenced. As soon as this was done, 2 French columns of infantry, preceded by a battalion in line, advanced along the edge of the wood, while a heavy mass of cavalry advanced along the Ghent road and threatened the Brunswickers with destruction. The Brunswick, Dutch, and Belgian skirmishers fell back before those of the French. The Duke of Brunswick placed himself before a regiment of lancers and charged the French infantry. But these stood steady and received the lancers with so heavy a fire that they retreated in confusion on Quatre Bras. The Duke now ordered the infantry to fall back in good order, but by this time they were too shaken to do so. The French artillery smote them with terrible effect. The infantry swept them with bullets. The cavalry were preparing to charge. No wonder, then, that the young troops lost their self-possession, broke, and fled in utter confusion, some through Quatre Bras, others through the English regiments on the left of the village. At this moment the gallant Duke of Brunswick, while striving to rally one of his regiments, received a mortar wound. He died a few minutes later, as his father had died on the field of Jena. The Brunswick hussars were now ordered to advance and cover the retreat of the infantry, but as they moved toward the enemy they lost heart, turned, and fled from the field, the French lancers charging hotly among them. So closely were the two bodies mixed together that the 42nd and 44th, which were posted on the left of the road, could not distinguish friend from foe. Before the former regiment had time to form square, the French were upon them, and for 2 or 3 minutes a desperate hand-to-hand conflict took place between bayonet and lance. The 44th did not attempt to form a square. Its colonel faced the rear rank about, and those poured so tremendous a volley into the French cavalry that they reeled back in confusion. 2 companies of the 42nd, which had been cut off from the rest, were almost annihilated, but the rest of the square closed in around French cavalry, who had pierced them and destroyed them to a man. The 28th also repulsed the enemy. "Well, what do you think of it now, Conway?" Captain O'Connor asked as the French retreated. "I feel all right now," Ralph said, "though I thought just now that it was all over with me. A big Frenchman was just dealing a sweeping cut at me when a musket shot struck him. Still, this is 1,000 times better than standing still and being pounded by their artillery. I confess I felt horribly uncomfortable while that was going on." "I dare say you did, lad." The Duke of Wellington had, upon the fall of their commander, in vain endeavoured to rally the flying Brunswickers. As he was so engaged, the cavalry column swept down upon him. He put spurs to his horse and galloped to the spot where the 92nd were lying behind a ditch bordering the road. The French were close to his heels. He shouted to the men of the 92nd in front of him to throw themselves down, and setting spurs to his horse, leaped the ditch and the men behind it, and instantly the Highlanders poured so terrible a volley into the French cavalry that 100 saddles were emptied. The cavalry recoiled for a moment in confusion, but then reformed and retired in good order. Some of the leading squadrons, however, had galloped on into the village and cut down some stragglers there, but the Highlanders closed round them, and being pent up in a farmyard from which there was but one outlet, scarce a man who had entered escaped. The French, who had now received heavy reinforcement, Kellerman's heavy horse having come upon the field, and as neither the Dutch nor Belgian cavalry would face the French troops, they were free to employ their whole cavalry force against the British infantry. Again and again they charged down upon the 28th, 42nd, 44th, and 1st Royals. The 28th and the Royals did not indeed wait to be attacked, but, led by Picton and Kempt in person, resolutely advanced to charge the French cavalry. This feat, seldom exampled in military history, was rendered necessary in order to cover the flank of the 42nd and 44th, now, by the flight of the Brunswickers, Dutch, and Belgians, open to the attacks of the French cavalry. The fields here were covered with a growth of tall rye that concealed the approach of the French cavalry till they were within a few yards of the infantry, and it was only by the tramp of the horses as they rushed through the corn that the British square knew when their foes would be upon them. Picton, in the centre of the 28th, encouraged them by his presence, and they stood firm, although the cavalry again and again charged down until their horses' chests touched the close line of bayonets. They were every time repulsed with heavy loss. The 32nd, 79th, and 95th were also exposed to similar attacks, but everywhere the British soldiers stood firmly, shoulder to shoulder, and nowhere did the French succeed in breaking their ranks. At 5 o'clock, fresh guns and cavalry reinforced Ney, and his infantry again advanced in great force through the wood of Bossu. The British squares were decimated by the fire of the artillery, and several batteries were advanced to comparatively short range and opened with destructive effect. Stoutly as the 8,000 British had fought, Deserted though they were by their allies, against Ney's overpowering numbers, they could not much longer have stood their ground, when at the critical moment General Alten's division came up the Nivelles road to their aid. Halkett's British brigade advanced between the wood of Bossu and the Charleroi road, while the Hanoverian brigade took up ground to the left, and gave their support to the hardly pressed British. Ney now pushed forward every man at his disposal. His masses of cavalry charged down, and falling upon the 69th, one of the regiments just arrived, cut it up terribly and carried off one of its colours. The 32nd, however, belonging to the same brigade, repulsed a similar attempt with terrible slaughter. The French infantry, supported by a column of cuirassiers, advanced against the Hanoverians, and driving them back, approached the spot where the 92nd were lying. Major General Barnes rode up to the Highlanders, taking off his hat, shouting, "Now, 92nd, follow me!" The Highlanders sprang from the ditch in which they were lying. The bagpipe struck up the slogan of the regiment, and with levelled bayonets they threw themselves upon the French column. In vain its leading companies attempted to make a stand. The Highlanders drove them back in confusion, and they broke and fled to the shelter of the hedgerows, where they tried to resist the advance, but the Highlanders burst through without a pause. Their colonel, John Cameron, fell dead, but his men, more furious than before, flung themselves on the French and drove them back in confusion into the wood. Ney still thought of renewing the attack, but d'Erlon's corps had not yet arrived, while at this moment 2 light battalions of Brunswickers, with 2 batteries of artillery, came up, and almost immediately afterward General Cook's division, comprising 2 brigades of the Guards, reached the spot. The latter at once advanced against the French skirmishers, just as they were issuing afresh from the woods of Bossu. The Guards had undergone a tremendous march, but all thought of fatigue was lost in their excitement, and they swept the French before them and pressed forward. As they did so, the whole British line advanced, Halkett's brigade on the one flank, the Guards on the other. In vain the French cavalry charged, again and again. In vain the French infantry strove to stem the tide. One after another the positions they had so hardly won were wrested from them. Picton's division retook the village. Piermont was carried by the 95th and the German Legion, while the Guards drove the enemy entirely out of the wood of Bossu. Night was now falling, and Ney fell back under cover of darkness to his original position in Frasnes, while the British lighted their fires and bivouacked on the ground they had so bravely held. As soon as the order came for the troops to bivouac where they were standing, arms were piled and the men set to work. Parties chopped down hedges and broke up fences, and fires were soon blazing. Owing to the late hour at which the fight terminated and the confusion among the baggage wagons that were now beginning to arrive from the rear, no regular distribution of rations could be made. Most of the men, however, had filled their haversacks before leaving their quarters on the previous evening, and a party sent down the road obtained a sufficient supply of bread for the rest from a commissariat wagon. While the fires were being lighted, the light companies were ordered to aid in the work of collecting the wounded. The other regiments had also sent out parties, and for hours the work went on. Owing to the frequent movements of the troops and the darkness of the night, it was difficult to discover the wounded, and there were no materials at hand from which torches could be made. No distinction was made between friend and foe. The bodies found to be cold and stiff were left where they lay. The rest were lifted and carried to one or another of the spots where the surgeons of the force were hard at work, giving a first dressing to the wounds, or, where absolutely necessary, performing amputations. After an hour's work, the light company was relieved by the grenadiers, and these in turn by the other companies, so that all might have a chance of obtaining as much sleep as possible. The troops were indeed terribly fatigued, for they had had a 30-mile march and nearly 6 hours of continuous fighting, but they were in high spirits at their success, although suffering severely from want of water. They had started in the morning with full canteens, but the dusty march had produced such thirst that most of these were emptied long before they reached the field of battle, and no water was to be found near the spot where the 28th was bivouacked, and indeed, with the exception of the regiments in the village who obtained water from the wells, the whole army lay down without a drink. Water had, however, been fetched for the wounded, whose first cry as their comrades reached them had always been for it, and even when the search had ceased for the night, there were numbers still lying in agony scattered over the field. Ralph had before starting filled a canteen with brandy and water at the suggestion of Captain O'Connor. "The less you drink, lad, while on the march, the better, but the chances are you'll find by night that every drop is worth its weight in gold. If you have the bad luck to be wounded yourself, the contents of the canteen may save your life, and if you don't want it yourself, you may be sure that there will be scores of poor fellows to whom a mouthful will be a blessing indeed." So Ralph had found it. He had drunk very sparingly on the way, scarcely permitting himself to do more than wet his lips. But when he set about the work of collecting the wounded, he felt more than amply rewarded for his little self-sacrifice by the grateful thanks of the poor fellows to whom he was able to give a mouthful of his hoarded store. It was not until his return to the bivouac after his hour's turn of duty that he learned the extent of the loss of the regiment. He knew by the smallness of the number who mustered for the search how much his own company had suffered, and in the brief intervals in the struggle he had heard something of what was doing elsewhere. Lieutenant Desmond had fallen early in the fight, shot through the heart as the light companies went out to oppose the French skirmishers. Captain O'Connor had received a lance wound through his arm, but had made a sling of his sash and had kept his place at the head of his company. The officers were all gathered round a fire when Ralph returned to the bivouac. "I see you have your arm in a sling, O'Connor," he said. "Nothing serious, I hope?" "No, I think not, but it's confoundedly painful. It was a French lancer did it. Fortunately, one of the men bayoneted him at the very instant he struck me, and it was only the head of the lance that went through my arm. Still, it made a hole big enough to be uncomfortably painful. The more so because it gave it a frightful wrench as the man dropped the lance. However, there's nothing to grumble at, and I may consider myself lucky indeed to have got off with a flesh wound when so many good fellows have fallen." "Yes, considering the number engaged, the losses have been terribly heavy," the major said. "It looked very bad for a time." "That it did," O'Connor agreed. "That's what comes of fighting with little mongrels by the side of you. It's always been the case when we get mixed up with other nationalities. Look at Fontenoy. Look at Talavera. If I were a general, I'd simply fight my battles in my own way with my own men. If any allies I had liked to come up and fight on their own account, all the better, but I wouldn't rely upon them in the very slightest." "The Belgians and Dutch fought very fairly at the beginning, O'Connor." "Yes, I will admit that. But what's the good of fighting at the beginning if you're going to bolt in the middle of a battle? If we'd had 2 or 3 regiments of our own cavalry, it would have made all the difference in the world. But when they went off, horse and foot, and left our division alone to face the whole force of the enemy, I hardly even hoped we should hold our ground till Alton came up." Yes, he just arrived in the nick of time, but even with him we should have had to fall back if Cook had not arrived with the guards. By the way, has anyone heard what has taken place on our left?" "No, we have heard nothing, but I think there is no doubt the Prussians must have been trashed. One could hear the roar of fire over there occasionally, and I'm sure it got farther off at the end of the day. Besides, if Blücher had beaten Napoleon, our friends over there would be falling back, and you can see by their long lines of fire that they've not done so. I dare say we shall hear all about it tomorrow. Anyhow, I think we'd better lie down and get as much sleep as we can. We may have another hard day's work before us." End of chapter 17. Quatre Bras. Recorded by Mike Harris. Chapter 18 of One of the 28th. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. One of the 28th by G. A. Henty. Chapter 18. Waterloo. The Prussians indeed had been beaten at Ligny. Their 3 corps, numbering 80,000 men, with 228 guns, had been attacked by Napoleon with 60,000 men, with 204 guns. The battle was contested with extraordinary obstinacy on both sides. The villages of Ligny and Saint-Armand were taken and retaken over and over again, and for hours the desperate strife in and around them continued without cessation. Both parties continued to send down reinforcements to these points, but neither could succeed in obtaining entire possession of them. The faults which Wellington had perceived in the Prussian position told against Blücher. The villages were too far in advance of the heights on which the army was posted, and his reinforcements were therefore a long time in reaching the spot where they were required to act. They were, too, as they descended the hill under the observation of Napoleon, who was able to anticipate their arrival by moving up supports on his side, and who noted the time when Blücher's last reserves behind Ligny had come into action. At this critical moment General Lobau arrived from Charleroi with 12,000 fresh men and 38 guns, and at 7 o'clock in the evening Napoleon launched this force with his division of guards, 20,000 strong, who had hitherto been kept in reserve, against the enemy. Ligny was captured and the victory won. The Prussians throughout the day had fought with great bravery. They had a long score to wipe out against the French, and were inspired as much by national hatred as by military ardour, and they owed their defeat rather to the disadvantages of the position they held than to the superior fighting qualities of the French. Their cavalry had several times made desperate charges, sometimes against the French horse, at others upon columns of infantry. In one of these Blucher himself was with them, and as they were in turn driven back by a charge of the French cuirassiers, his horse was shot, bringing him to the ground. His aide-de-camp leaped off and threw his cloak over him as the cuirassiers came thundering past, intent upon overtaking the Prussian cavalry. They paid no attention to the solitary dismounted man, and a few minutes later again passed the spot, this time in retreat, a fresh party of Prussian cavalry having met them. Again they passed by the fallen general, little dreaming that one of their most formidable and determined enemies lay there at their mercy. As soon as the Prussians came up, the dead horse was removed, and Blucher, who was insensible, carried to the rear, when he soon recovered and resumed the command. But though beaten, the Prussians were by no means routed. They had lost the key of their position, but night came on before the combat terminated, and under cover of the darkness they fell back quietly and in good order. General Thielmann's corps on the extreme Prussian left had taken but little part in the fighting, and as the centre and right of the Prussian army retreated, he advanced, fell upon the French in the darkness, and for some time forced them back, thus giving time to the rest of the army to reform its ranks and recover its discipline. After having rendered great service by thus occupying the enemy, Thielmann took up a position on the heights and remained facing the French, while the other corps d'armée took position in his rear. The French were too weary to follow up the advantage they had gained. The night passed without any attack being made, and at daybreak the Prussians started on their march to Wavre, the cavalry remaining behind to cover the movement, checking pursuit and conceal, if possible, from the French the line by which the army was falling back. Had the pursuit been taken up at daybreak by the French, they would soon have driven in the cavalry and ascertained the route taken by the infantry, but it was not until many hours had elapsed that the French got into motion, and by that time the Prussian cavalry had disappeared from their front, and nothing remained to inform them of the line by which the enemy had retreated. There was a general feeling of disappointment among the gallant defenders of Quatre Bras when, on the following morning, orders were issued for them to abandon the ground they had so stoutly held. They had been astir at daylight, firearms were cleaned, fresh ammunition served out from the reserve wagons, and the men fell into the ranks, expecting that in a short time they would again be engaged. But no movement could be seen on the part of the enemy, and arms were again piled. The commissariat wagons had come up in the night, and rations were served out to the troops and breakfast prepared. As soon as this was over, strong parties were again sent over the battlefield to collect any wounded who had escaped the search of the night before. As soon as these were collected, the whole of the wounded were placed in ambulance wagons and country carts and dispatched to Brussels. Presently a general movement of the great baggage trains was observed by the troops to be taking place, and the long column moved along the road to the north. The Duke had sent off a staff officer at daybreak to ascertain the state of things at Ligny. He returned with the report that the Prussians had left the field. He then sent out a small party of cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel Sir Alexander Gordon. This officer pushed forward until he encountered General Zieten, who was still at Saint-Preux, but a mile distant from the battlefield. The general informed him of the whole events of the preceding day, and gave him the important intelligence that Blucher had retreated to Wavre, and would join hands with Wellington at Mont-Saint-Jean, which the English general had previously fixed upon as the scene of the battle for the defence of Brussels. The news relieved Wellington of all anxiety. It had been before arranged that Blucher, if defeated, should if possible fall back to Wavre, but it was by no means certain that he would be able to do this, and had he been compelled by the events of the conflict to retire upon his base at Namur, he would have been unable to effect a junction for some days with Wellington, and the latter would have been obliged single-handed to bear the whole brunt of Napoleon's attack. The latter's plan had indeed been entirely based on the supposition that Blucher would retreat upon Namur, and in order to force him to do so, he had abstained from all attack upon the Prussian left, and employed his whole force against the right and centre, so as to swing him round and force him to retire by way of Namur. As soon as Wellington learned that Blucher had carried out the arrangement agreed upon, his mind was at ease. Orders were sent off at once to the troops advancing from various directions that they should move upon Mont Saint-Jean. All the baggage was sent back to Brussels, while provisions for the troops were to be left at Mont Saint-Jean, where also the whole of the ammunition wagons were to be concentrated. Horsemen were sent along the roads to keep the baggage train moving, and they had orders that if the troops at Quatre Bras fell back upon them, they were at once to clear the road of all vehicles. Having issued all these orders and seen that everything was in train, Wellington allowed the troops at Quatre Bras to rest themselves, and ordered their dinners to be cooked. No movement was yet to be seen on the part of the French. There was, therefore, no occasion to hurry. Those, therefore, of the men who were not out on patrol stretched themselves on the ground and rested till noon. Dinner over, the infantry marched off in 2 columns, the cavalry remaining until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when upon the advance of Ney in front and Napoleon on the left, they fell back, and after some sharp skirmishes with the enemy's light cavalry, joined the infantry before nightfall in their position near Mont Saint-Jean and Waterloo. Rain had fallen for a time during the afternoon of the battle, and now at 4 o'clock it again began to come down heavily, soaking the troops to the skin. "This is miserable, Stapleton," Ralph said to his friend after the regiment had piled arms on the ground, pointed out to them by the officers of the quartermaster's department. "Well, I'm rather glad to hear you say it is miserable, Ralph. I was certainly thinking so myself, but you always accuse me of being a grumbler, and so I thought I would hold my tongue." Ralph laughed. "I don't think anyone could deny that it's miserable, Stapleton, but some people keep up their spirits under miserable circumstances, and others don't. This is one of the occasions on which it's really very hard to feel cheerful. There's not a dry thing in the regiment, the rain is coming down steadily, and looks as if it meant to keep it up all night. The ground is fast turning into soft mud, and we've got to sleep upon it, or rather in it, for by the time we're ready to lie down it will be soft enough to let us sink right in. I think the best plan will be to try to get hold of a small bundle of rushes or straw, or something of that sort, to keep our heads above it, otherwise we shall risk a suffocation." "It is beastly," Stapleton said emphatically. "Look at the men. What a change in them since we marched along this road yesterday. Then they were full of fun and spirits, and now they look washed out and miserable. Were the French to attack us now, you wouldn't see our men fight as you did yesterday." "Ah, but you must remember, Stapleton, the French are just as wet as we are. This is not a little private rain of our own, you know, got up for our special annoyance, but it extends right over the country." "What nonsense you talk, Conway, as if I didn't know that." "Well, you spoke as if you didn't, Stapleton. But you will see the fellows will fight when they are called upon. Just at present they're not only wet, but they're disgusted, and I own it is disgusting, after fighting as hard as we did yesterday, to find it's all been of no use, and that instead of marching against the enemy, we're marching away from them. Of course it can't be helped, and if we had waited another half hour we should have had all the French army on us, and yesterday's work would have been mere child's play to it. Still, I can quite enter into the soldiers' feelings. Of course, they do not understand the position, and regard it as simply a retreat, instead of a mere shifting of ground to take up better position and fight again tomorrow. Still, this is a nice position, isn't it? You see, there's room enough along on the top of this slope for our whole army, and our guns will sweep the dip between us and the opposite rise, and if they attack, they'll have to experience the same sensations we did yesterday of being pounded and pounded without the satisfaction of being able to return their fire. They must cross that dip to get at us, at least if they attack, which I suppose they will, as they will be the strongest party, and our artillery will be able to play upon them splendidly from this road. Then, too, there are 2 or 3 farmhouses nearer our side than theirs, and I suppose they will be held in force. That looks rather a nice old place among the trees there on our right. It has a wall and an enclosure, and they will have hard work to turn us out of it. Yes, I call this a fine place for a battle, and we shall have the advantage here of being able to see all over the field, and of knowing what's going on in other places, while yesterday one couldn't see 3 yards before one. During the whole time one was fighting, one felt that it might be of no use at all, for we might be getting smashed up in some other part of the field." "Well, actually, I never thought anything about it," Stapleton said. "My only idea was that I must look as if I wasn't afraid, and must set a good example to the men, and that it was all very unpleasant, and that probably my turn might come next. and that I would give a good deal for something like a gallon of beer. As far as I can remember, those were my leading ideas yesterday." "Well, Dennis, what is it?" Ralph asked his servant, who approached with a long face. "Have you any dry tinder about you, your honour? I've been trying to strike a light for the last half hour till the tinder box is full of water, and I've knocked all the skin off my knuckles." "Well, that's bad, Dennis, but I don't think you'll get a fire anyhow. The wood must be all too soaked to burn." "I think it'll go, sir, if I once get it to light. I pulled up some pea sticks from an old woman's garden, and the old witch came out and began at me as if I was robbing her of her eldest daughter. It was lucky I had a shilling about me, but jabers, she'd have brought down the provost's guard upon me, and then maybe I would have had my back warmed, the least taste of the world more than was pleasant. I had the sticks under a wagon to keep them dry, and Mike Doolan is standing sentry over them. I promised him a stick or two for his own kindling. The weather's too bad entirely, your honour, and the boys are well nigh broken-hearted at turning their backs to the Frenchmen." "Aye, well, they'll turn their faces tomorrow, Dennis. And as for the weather, I guess you've got wet before now digging praties in the old country." "I have that, your honour, many and many a time, and it's little I cared for it. But then there was a place to go into, and dry clothes to put on, and a warm meal to look forward to, with perhaps a drop of the crater afterward. And that makes all the difference in the world. But we're going to do tonight, sorra me knows." "You'll have to lie down in the mud, Dennis." "Is it lie down, your honour? And when shall I get the mud off my uniform? And what will the Duke say in the morning if he comes round and sees me looking like a hog that's been rowling in his sty?" "You won't be worse than anyone else, Dennis. You see, we shall all be in the same boat. Well, here's the tinder. I should recommend you to break up a cartridge and sprinkle the powder in among the leaves that you light your fire with." "That's the difficulty, your honour. I got some wood, but divil a dry leaf can I find." "Look here, Dennis. Open your knapsack under the wagon and take out a shirt and tear it into strips. You'll soon get a fire with that, and we can easily replace the shirt afterwards." "Aye, that's a grand idea, your honour. That'll do it, sure enough. Faith, and when the boys see how I do it, there'll be many a shirt burned this evening." "But how about wood, Dennis?" "Oh, there's plenty of wood, your honour. The commissaries have had 2 or 3 score of woodcutters at work on the edge of the forest all day, and there's timber felled and split enough for all of us and to spare. The pioneers of all the regiments have gone off with their axes to help, and I'll warrant there'll be a blaze all along the line presently. Now I'll be off, your honour, for the cooks are ready to boil the kettles as soon as we can get a fire." Great masses of the enemy could now be seen arriving on the crest of the opposite rise. Presently these broke up into regiments, and then moved along the crest, halted, and fell out. It was evident that nothing would be done until morning, for it was already beginning to get dusk. In a few minutes smoke rose in the rear of the regiment, and ere long half a dozen great fires were blazing. Men came from the regiments near to borrow brands. The news soon spread along the line of the means by which the 28th had kindled their fires, and, as Dennis had foretold, the number of shirts sacrificed for this purpose was large. Strong parties from each regiment were told off to go to the woodpiles and bring up logs, and in spite of the continued downfall of rain, the men's spirits rose, and merry laughs were heard among the groups gathered round the fires. The officers had one to themselves, and a kettle was soon boiling, and tin cups of strong grog handed round. Of food, however, there was little beyond what scraps remained in the haversacks. The commissariat wagons had retired from Quatre Bras to leave room for those carrying the ammunition, and were now so far in the rear that it was impossible to get at their contents and distribute them among the troops. For an hour or two they chatted round the fire, and discussed the probabilities of the struggle that would begin in the morning. Just as night fell, there was a sharp artillery fight between 2 batteries of Picton's division and the same number of the French. The latter commenced the fire by opening fire upon the infantry position, but were too far away to do much harm. Picton's guns got the range of a column of infantry, and created great havoc among them. Darkness put a stop to the fight, but until late at night skirmishes took place between the outposts. A troop of the 7th Hussars charged and drove back a body of light cavalry, who kept on disturbing the vedettes, and the 2nd Light Dragoons of the King's German Legion, posted in front of Hougoumont, charged and drove back a column of the enemy's cavalry that approached too close. Gradually the fires burned low, the incessant downpour of rain so drenching the logs that it was impossible to keep them alight, and the troops lay down with their knapsacks under their heads, turned the capes of the greatcoats over their faces, and in spite of the deep soft mud below them and the pouring rain above, soon sank to sleep. All night long a deep sound filled the air, telling of the heavy trains of artillery and ammunition wagons arriving from the rear to both armies, but nothing short of a heavy cannonade would have aroused the weary soldiers from their deep sleep. At 12 o'clock Ralph was called up, as his company had to relieve that which furnished the posts in front of the position of the regiment. The orders were not to fire unless fired upon. A third of the men were thrown out as sentries, the other lay upon the ground 50 yards in the rear, ready to move forward to their support if necessary. Captain O'Connor left Ralph with the reserve, and himself paced up and down along the line of sentries, who were relieved every hour until morning broke, when the company rejoined the regiment. The troops could now obtain a view of the ground upon which they were to fight. Their line extended some 2 miles in length along the brow of a gradually sloping rise, the two extremities of which projected somewhat beyond the centre. The ground was open, without woods or hedgerows, and about halfway down the slope lay 4 farms. On the right was Hougoumont, a chateau with farm buildings attached to it, and a chapel. In front of this lay a thick wood with a close hedge, and the house and farm buildings were surrounded by a strong wall. In front of the centre of the line lay the farm and enclosures of La Haye Sainte, abutting on the main Charleroi road, which, as it passed the farm, ran between 2 deep banks. In front of the left of the line were the hamlets of Papelotte and La Haye. At the top of the ridge the ground sloped backward, and the infantry were posted a little in the rear of the crest, which hid them from the sight of the enemy, and protected them from artillery fire. The whole of the slope, and the valley beyond it, was covered with waving corn or high grass, now ready for cutting. Upon the opposite side of the valley there was a similar rise, and on this was the French position. Nearly in the centre of this stood the farm called La Belle Alliance, close to which Napoleon took up his stand during the battle. Behind the British position the ground fell away, and then rose again gently to a crest, on which stood the villages of Waterloo and Mont Saint-Jean. The great forest of Soignies extended to this point, so that, if obliged to fall back, Wellington had in his rear a position as defensible as that which he now occupied. The allies were arranged in the following order. On the extreme left were Vandeleur's and Vivien's light cavalry brigades. Then came Picton's division, the first line being composed of Hanoverians, Dutch, and Belgians, with Pack's British brigade, which had suffered so severely in Quatre Bras, in its rear, and Kempt's brigade extending to the Charleroi road. Alten's division was on the right of Picton's. Its second brigade, close to the road, consisted of the 1st and 2nd light battalions of the German Legion and the 6th and 8th battalions of the line. The 2nd German battalion was stationed in the farm of La Haye Sainte. Next to these came a Hanoverian brigade, on the right of whom were Halkett's British brigade. On the extreme right was Cook's division, consisting of 2 brigades of the Guards, having with them a Nassau regiment and 2 companies of Hanoverian riflemen. Behind the infantry line lay the cavalry. In reserve were a brigade of the 4th Division, the whole of the 2nd Division, and the Brunswickers, Dutch, and Belgians. The artillery were placed at intervals between the infantry, and on various commanding points along the ridge. The Duke had expected to be attacked early, and as it was of the utmost importance to Napoleon to crush the British before the Prussians could come up, but the rain, which began to hold up as daylight appeared, had so soddened the deep soil that Napoleon thought that his cavalry, upon whom he greatly depended, would not be able to act, and he therefore lost many precious hours before he set his troops in motion. From the British position the heavy masses of French troops could be seen moving on the opposite heights to get into positions assigned to them, for it was scarcely a mile from the crest of one slope to that of the other. In point of numbers the armies were not ill-matched. Wellington had 49,608 infantry, 12,402 cavalry, 5,645 artillerymen, and 156 guns. Napoleon, who had detached Grouchy with his division in pursuit of the Prussians, had with him 48,950 infantry, 15,765 cavalry, 7,232 artillerymen, and 246 guns. He had therefore 4,300 men and 90 guns more than Wellington, but this does not represent the full disparity of strength, for Wellington had but 18,500 British infantry, including the German Legion, who, having fought through the Peninsular, were excellent troops, 7,800 cavalry, and 3,500 artillery. The remainder of his force consisted of troops of Hanover, Brunswick, Nassau, Holland, and Belgium, upon whom comparatively little reliance could be placed. The British infantry consisted almost entirely of young soldiers, while the whole of Napoleon's force were veterans. As early as 6 o'clock in the morning both armies had taken up the positions in which they were intended to fight. The British infantry were lying down, the cavalry dismounted in their rear, and so completely were they hidden from the sight of the French that Napoleon believed they had retreated, and was greatly enraged at their having, as he supposed, escaped him. While he was expressing his annoyance, General Foy, who had served against the Duke in the Peninsula, rode up and said, "Your Majesty is distressing yourself without just reason. Wellington never shows his troops until they are needed. A patrol of horse will soon find out whether he is before us or not, and if he be, I warn your Majesty that the British infantry are the very devil to fight." The Emperor soon discovered that the British were still in front of him, for the English regiments were directed to clean their arms by firing them off, and the heavy fusillade reached Napoleon's ears. At 8 o'clock, Wellington, who was anxiously looking over in the direction from which he expected the Prussians to appear, saw a body of mounted men in the distance, and soon afterward a Prussian orderly rode in and informed him that they were on the march to his assistance and would soon be on the field. Grouchy had, in fact, altogether failed to intercept them. Napoleon had made up his mind that after Ligny the Prussians would retreat toward Namur, and sent Grouchy in pursuit of them along the road. That officer had gone many miles before he discovered the route that they had really taken, and only came up with the rear of their column at Wavre on the morning of Waterloo. Blucher left one division to oppose him, and marched with the other 3 to join Wellington. It was not until nearly 10 o'clock that the French attack began. Then a column moved down from the heights of La Belle Alliance against the wood of Hougoumont, and as it approached, the leading companies broke up into skirmishing order. As these arrived within musketry range, a scattering fire broke out from the hedges in front of the wood, and the Battle of Waterloo had begun. Soon from the high ground behind Hougoumont, the batteries of artillery opened fire on the French column. Its skirmishers advanced bravely and constantly reinforced, drove back the Hanoverian and Nassau riflemen in front of the wood. Then Bull's battery of howitzers opened with shell upon them, and so well were these served that the French skirmishers fell back, hotly pressed by the 1st and 2nd Brigade of Guards issuing from the chateau. The roar of cannon speedily extended along both crests, the British aiming at the French columns, the French, who could see no foes with the exception of the lines of skirmishers, firing upon the British batteries. The French therefore suffered severely, while the Allies, sheltered behind the crest, were only exposed to the fire of the shot which grazed the ground in front, and then came plunging in among them. Prince Jerome, who commanded on Napoleon's left, sent strong columns of support to his skirmishers, acting against the right of the wood of Hougoumont, while Foy's division moved to attack it in front. In spite of a terrific fire of artillery poured upon them, these brave troops moved on, supported by the concentrated fire of their powerful artillery against the British position. The light companies of the Guards, after an obstinate resistance, were forced back through the wood. The French pushed on through the trees until they reached the hedge, which seemed to them to be the only defence of the buildings. But 30 yards in the rear was the orchard wall, flanked on the right by the low brick terraces of the garden. The whole of these had been carefully loopholed, and so terrible a storm of fire opened upon the French that they recoiled and sought shelter among the trees and the ditches in the rear. Prince Jerome, seeing that his skirmishers had won the wood, and knowing nothing of the formidable defences that arrested their advance, poured fresh masses of men down to their assistance. Although they suffered terribly from the British artillery fire, they gathered in the wood in such numbers that they gradually drove back the defenders into the buildings and yard, and completely surrounded the chateau. The defenders had not even time properly to barricade the gate. This was burst open, and dense masses rushed in. The guards met them with the bayonet, and after fierce fighting drove them out and closed the gate again, and with their musketry fire compelled them to fall back from the buildings. Some of the French, however, advanced higher up the slope and opened fire upon one of the batteries with such effect that it had to withdraw. 4 fresh companies of the Guards advanced against them, clearing them away, and reinforced the defenders of the chateau. A desperate fight raged round the buildings, and one of the enemy's shells, falling upon the chateau, set it on fire. But the defence still continued, until Lord Saltoun, repulsing a desperate attack, and reinforced by 2 companies which came down the hill to his assistance, drove the enemy back and recaptured the orchard. This desperate conflict had lasted for 3 hours. While it was going on, Ney led 20,000 men against the centre and left of the British position, advancing as usual in heavy column. Just as they were setting out at 1 o'clock, Napoleon discovered the Prussians advancing. He sent off a despatch to Grouchy ordering him to move straight upon the field of battle, but that general did not receive it until 7 in the evening, when the fight was nearly over. It was just 2 in the afternoon when the columns poured down the hill, their attack heralded by a terrific fire upon the British line opposed to them. The slaughter among Picton's division was great, but although the Dutch and Hanoverians were shaken by the iron hail, they stood their ground. When the columns reached the dip of the valley and began to ascend the slopes toward the British division, they threw out clouds of skirmishers, and between these and the light troops of the Allies firing at once began and increased in volume as the French neared the advanced posts of La Haye-Sainte, Papelotte, and La Haye. The division of Duret drove out the Nassau troops from Papelotte, but reinforcements arrived from the British line, and the French in turn were expelled. The other 3 French columns advanced steadily, with 30 light guns in the intervals between them. Donzelat's brigade attacked La Haye-Sainte, and in spite of a gallant resistance by the Germans made its way into the orchard and surrounded the enclosures. Another brigade, pushing along on the other side of the Charleroi road, were met by the fire of 2 companies of the Rifle Brigade who occupied a sand pit there, and by their heavy and accurate fire checked the French advance. The other 2 divisions moved straight against that part of the crest held by Picton's division. The men of the Dutch-Belgian brigade, as soon as fire was opened upon them, lost all order and took to their heels amid the yells and execrations of the brigades of Kempt and Pack behind them, and it was with difficulty that the British soldiers were kept from firing into the fugitives. The Dutch artillery behind them tried to arrest the mob, but nothing could stop them. They fairly ran over the guns, men, and horses, rushed down the valley and through the village of Mont Saint-Jean, and were not seen again in the field during the rest of the day. Picton's division was now left alone to bear the brunt of the French attack. The battle at Quatre Bras had terribly thinned its ranks, and the 2 brigades together did not muster more than 3,000 men. Picton formed the whole in line and prepared to resist the charge of 13,000 infantry, besides heavy masses of cavalry, who were pressing forward, having, in spite of a stout resistance, driven in the riflemen from the sandpit and the road above it. As the columns neared the British line, the fire from the French batteries suddenly ceased, their own troops now serving as a screen to the British. The heads of the columns halted and began to deploy into line. Picton seized the moment and shouted, "A volley! Then charge!" The French were but 30 yards away. A tremendous volley was poured into them, and then the British, with a shout, rushed forward, scrambled through a double hedgerow that separated them from the French, and fell upon them with a bayonet. The charge was irresistible. Taken in the act of deploying, the very numbers of the French told against them, and they were borne down the slope in confusion. Picton, struck by a musket ball in the head, fell dead, and Kempt assumed the command, and his brigade followed up the attack and continued to drive the enemy down the hill. In the meantime, the French cavalry were approaching. The cuirassiers had passed La Haye-Sainte and almost cut to pieces a Hanoverian battalion which was advancing to reinforce the defenders. At this moment, Lord Edward Somerset led the household brigade of cavalry against the cuirassiers, and the elite of the cavalry of the 2 nations met with a tremendous shock. But the weight and impetus of the heavy British horsemen, aided by the fact that they were descending the hill, while their opponents had hardly recovered their formation after cutting up the Hanoverians, proved irresistible, and the cuirassiers had driven down the hill. A desperate hand-to-hand conflict took place, and it was here that Shaw, who had been a prize fighter before he enlisted in the 2nd Life Guards, killed no less than 7 Frenchmen with his own hand, receiving, however, so many wounds that on the return of the regiment from its charge he could no longer sit his horse, and crawling behind a house died there from loss of blood. While the 2nd Life Guards and 1st Dragoon Guards pursued the cuirassiers down the slope, the Royals, Scots Greys, and Inniskillens rode to the assistance of Pack's brigade, which had been assailed by 4 strong brigades of the enemy. Pack rode along at the front of his line, calling upon his men to stand ready. The enemy crossed a hedge within 40 yards of the 92nd and delivered their fire. The Highlanders waited till they approached within half the distance, then pouring in a volley, charged with levelled bayonets. The French stood firm, and the 92nd, numbering less than 250 men, burst in among them, a mere handful among their foes. But just at this moment Ponsonby's heavy cavalry came up, and passing through the intervals of the companies and battalions, fell upon the French infantry. In vain the enemy endeavoured to keep their formation. Their front was burst in, their centre penetrated, and their rear dispersed. and in 5 minutes the great column was a mass of fugitives. Great numbers were killed, and 2,000 prisoners taken. End of Chapter 18, Waterloo. Recording by Mike Harris. Chapter 19 of One of the 28th. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. One of the 28th by G.A. Henty. Chapter 19. The Rout. While Pack's brigade secured the prisoners taken by the cavalry and sent them to the rear, the cavalry themselves continued their charge. In vain Ponsonby ordered the trumpeters to sound the halt. Carried away by the excitement of their success, an excitement in which the horses shared, the 3 regiments galloped on. The Royals on the right fell upon 2 French regiments advancing in column, broke them and cut them up terribly. The Inniskillens also fell on 2 French line regiments, shattered them with their charge, and took great numbers of prisoners, whole companies running up the hill and surrendering to the infantry in order to escape from the terrible horsemen. The cavalry were now terribly scattered. The 3 regiments of Ponsonby's brigade were far down in the valley, as were the 2nd Life Guards and 1st Dragoon Guards. The 1st Life Guards and the Blues were still engaged with the cuirassiers, opposed to them, for these, although driven back, were fighting doggedly. The Greys, who should have been in reserve, galloped ahead and joined Ponsonby's squadron, and the 2 brigades of heavy cavalry were far away from all support. When they reached the bottom of the hill, a tremendous fire was poured from a compact corps of infantry and some pieces of cannon on the right into the Royals, Inniskillens, and 2nd Life Guards, and a fresh column of cuirassiers advanced against them. They wheeled about and fell back in great confusion and with heavy loss, their horses being completely blown with their long gallop across the heavy ground. These regiments had fared, however, better than the Greys, Royals, and Inniskillens on the left, for they, having encountered no infantry fire, had charged up the hill until level with the French guns, when, turning sharp to the left, they swept along the line, cutting up the artillerymen, until suddenly they were charged by a brigade of lancers, while a large body of infantry threatened their line of retreat. Fortunately, at this moment, the light cavalry came up to their assistance. Riding right through the infantry column, the light cavalry fell upon the French lancers and rolled them over with the fury of their charge, and then charged another regiment of lancers and checked their advance. Light and heavy horse were now mixed up together, and a fresh body of French cavalry, coming up, drove them down the hill with great loss, they being saved indeed from total destruction by the 11th Hussars, who, coming up last, had kept their formation. Covered by these, the remnants of the cavalry regained their own crest on the hill, and reformed under cover of the infantry. General Ponsonby was killed, and his brother, the colonel of the 12th, severely wounded and left on the field. While this desperate fight had been raging on the centre and left, fresh columns had advanced from Jerome's and Foy's divisions against Hougoumont, and had again, after obstinate fighting, captured the orchard and surrounded the chateau, but were once more repulsed by a fresh battalion of guards who moved down the slope to the assistance of their hard-pressed comrades. Then for a while the fighting slacked, but the artillery duel raged as fiercely as ever. The gunners on both sides had now got the exact range, and the carnage was terrible. The French shells again set Hougoumont on fire, and all the badly wounded who had been carried inside perished in the flames. At the end of an hour, fresh columns of attack moved against the chateau, while at the same moment 40 squadrons of cavalry advanced across the valley toward the English position. The English batteries played upon them with round shot, and as they came near, with grape and canister. But the horsemen rode on, and at a steady trot arrived within 40 yards of the English squares, when with a shout they galloped forward, and in a moment the whole of the advanced batteries of the Allies were in their possession. For Wellington's orders had been that the artillerymen should stand to their guns till the last moment, and then run for shelter behind the squares. The French cavalry paused for a moment in astonishment at the sight that met their eyes. They had believed that the British were broken and disorganized, but no sooner had they passed over the slope than they saw the British and German squares bristling with bayonets and standing calm and immovable. The artillery on both sides had ceased their fire, and a dead silence had succeeded the terrible din that had raged but a moment before. Then with a shout the cavalry again charged, but in no case did they dash against the hedges of bayonets, from which a storm of fire was now pouring. Breaking into squadrons, they rode through the intervals between the squares and completely enveloped them. But Lord Uxbridge gathered the remains of the British cavalry together, charged them, and drove them back through the squares and down the hill. Receiving reinforcements, the French again advanced, again enveloped the squares, and were again hurled back. While this was going on, the battle was still raging round Hougoumont and La Haye Sainte, against which a portion of Riel's division had advanced. But the Germans resisted as obstinately as did the Guards, and as the French cavalry retired for the second time, the infantry fell back, and for a time the slope of the English position was again clear of the enemy. For a time the battle languished, and then Napoleon brought up 37 fresh squadrons of cavalry, and these, with the remains of those who had before charged, rode up the slope. But although they swept on and passed the British squares, they could not succeed in shaking them. A body of horse, however, sweeping down toward the Dutch and Belgians at the end of the line, these at once marched off the field without firing a musket, and the brigade of cavalry with them galloped away at full speed. The position was a singular one, and had Napoleon ordered his infantry to advance in the rear of the cavalry, the issue of the day might have been changed. In appearance the French were masters of the position. Their masses of cavalry hid the British squares from sight. The British cavalry were too weak to charge, and most of the guns were in the possession of the French. But the latter's infantry were far away, and after sustaining the fire of the squares for a long time, the cavalry began to draw off. Lord Uxbridge now endeavoured to persuade the Cumberland Hanoverian hussars, who had not so far been engaged, to charge, but instead of obeying orders they turned and rode off and never drew bridle until they reached Brussels, where they reported that the British army had been destroyed. Adams' brigade were now brought up from the reserve and drove back the French infantry and cavalry who had come up the top of the crest beyond Hougoumont. On the other side, Ney sent a column against La Haye Sainte. The Germans made a gallant stand, but they were cut off from all assistance, outnumbered, and were altogether without ammunition. And although they defended themselves with their bayonets to the end, they were slain almost to a man, and La Haye Sainte was captured at last. But beyond this the French could not advance, and though column after column moved forward to the attack on the crest, they were each and all beaten back. It was now nearly 7 o'clock in the evening, and the Prussians were engaged at Saint-Lambert, Napoleon having detached Lobau's corps to arrest their progress. Their march had been a terrible one. They had to traverse country roads softened by the rain. The men were up to their ankles in mud. Guns and carriages stuck fast, and it was not until after tremendous efforts that the leading squadron of their cavalry passed through the wood of Wavre and came in view of the battle that was raging. It was then past 4 o'clock, and another hour passed before any considerable number of infantry arrived. It was at this point Napoleon sent Lobau against them. He was able for a time to resist their advance, but as fresh troops came up from the rear, the Prussians began to win their way forward, and Napoleon was obliged to send 2 more divisions of the Young Guard to check them. He now saw that all was lost, unless he could, before the whole of the Prussian army arrived, break down the resistance of the British. He therefore prepared for a final effort. Ney was to collect all his infantry, and advancing past La Haye Sainte, to fall upon the centre of the British line. The Guard, who had hitherto been held in reserve, was to pass Hougoumont and attack the left centre. The cavalry were to follow in support. A cannonade even more heavy and terrible than before, for the guns of the reserve had been brought up, opened upon the British, and the squares were now melting away fast. But no reinforcements could be sent to them, for the whole of the British troops were now in action, and their allies had for the most part fled the battlefield. Every gun was brought to the front, the remains of the cavalry gathered together as a reserve, and some of the Prussians now approaching the left, the cavalry there were brought to the centre to aid in the defence of the threatened point. Just as these arrangements were completed, the enemy advanced in tremendous force from the enclosure of La Haye Sainte, and with their fire so completely mastered that of the remnants of the infantry that their light guns were brought up to within 100 yards of the British line, and opened with grape upon the squares. 2 Hanoverian battalions were almost annihilated, and the brigade of the German Legion almost ceased to exist. A Brunswick cavalry regiment that had hitherto fought gallantly lost heart, and would have fled had not the British cavalry behind them prevented them from doing so. In the meantime, the Imperial Guard, in 2 heavy columns, led by Ney himself, were advancing. the Guards being followed by every available man of the infantry and cavalry. One of these columns skirted the enclosure of the Hougoumont, the other moved against the centre. They pressed forward until they reached the top of the slope, and 100 cannon were brought up and unlimbered, while the artillery on the opposite slope rained round shot and shell upon the British squares and artillery. The English guns tried in vain to answer them. They were wholly overmatched. Gun after gun was dismounted, horses and men destroyed, but as soon as the leading column of the Guards reached the point when their own guns had to cease fire, the English artillery opened again, and terrible was the havoc they made in the dense columns. Still the Guards pressed on until they reached the top of the crest, and then the British Guards leaped to their feet and poured in a tremendous volley at close quarters, fell on the flank of the column, broke it, and hurled it down the hill. The Guards were recalled and prepared to oppose the second column, but their aid was not needed. The 52nd threw themselves upon its flank, the 71st and 95th swept its head with their volleys, and as the column broke and retired, the Duke of Wellington gave the orders the men had been longing for since the fight began. The squares broke into lines, and the British, cheering wildly, descended the crest. The French retreat became a rout. Cavalry and infantry fell upon them, the artillery plied them with their fire, the Prussians poured down upon their flank. By 8 o'clock the splendid army of Napoleon was a mass of disorganized fugitives. For 10 hours the battle had raged. To the men in the squares it seemed a lifetime. "When shall we get at them? When shall we get at them?" was their constant cry as the round shot swept their ranks, although from their position behind the crest they could see nothing of their enemies. Nothing is harder than to suffer in inactivity, and the efforts of their officers were principally directed to appeasing the impatience of their men. "Our turn will come presently, lads." "Yes, but who will be alive when it does come?" A query which was very hard to answer, as hour by hour the ranks melted away. Although they kept a cheerful countenance and spoke hopefully to the men, it seemed to the officers themselves that the prospect was well nigh hopeless. Picton's brigade mustered scarcely half their strength when the battle began. They were to have fought in the second line this day, but the defection of their allies in front of them had placed them in the front, and upon them and upon the defenders of Hougoumont the brunt of the battle had fallen. And as the squares grew smaller and smaller, it seemed even to the officers that the end must come before long. "This cannot last," Captain O'Connor said to Ralph when the day was but half over. "They'll never beat us, but by the time they get here there will be nobody left to beat. I don't think we're more than 200 strong now, and every minute the force is diminishing. I don't wonder the men are impatient. We bargained for fighting, but I never reckoned on standing for hours to be shot at, without even a chance to reply." It was just after this that the French cavalry burst upon the squares, but this cheered rather than depressed the spirits of the men. For a time they were free from the artillery fire, and now had a chance of active work. Thus, as the fire flashed from the faces of the square, the men laughed and joked, and it was with regret that they saw the cuirassiers fall back before the charge of Lord Uxbridge's cavalry, for they knew that the moment this screen was removed the French artillery would open up again. Ralph's chief sensation was that of wonder that he was still alive. So overwhelming was the din, so incessant the rain of shot, it seemed to him a marvel how anyone could remain alive within its range. Almost mechanically he repeated the orders, "Close up, close up," as the square dwindled and dwindled. He longed as impatiently as the men for the advance, and would gladly have charged against impossible odds rather than remain immovable under fire. When the order at length came he did not hear it. Just after the storm of fire that heralded the advance of the Guards broke out, a round shot struck him high up on the left arm. He was conscious of a dull, numbing sensation, and after that he knew no more of what was taking place. It was pitch dark before he became conscious. Fires were burning at various points along the ridge, for when the victory was complete the British retired to the position they had held so long, and the Prussian cavalry took up the pursuit. Fires had been lighted with broken gun carriages and shattered artillery wagons, and parties with torches were collecting the wounded. Ralph found that his head was being supported, and that a hand was pouring spirits and water down his throat. The hand was a shaky one, and its owner was crying loudly. As he opened his eyes, the man broke into a torrent of thankful exclamations. "The Lord be praised, Mr. Conway. Sure, I thought you were dead and killed entirely." "Is that you, Dennis?" "Sure, and it's no one else, your honour." "Is the battle over?" "It is that. The French are miles away, and the Prussians are at their heels." "What has happened to me, Dennis?" "Well, your honour's hurt a bit in the arm, but it'll be all right presently." It was well for Ralph that he had been struck before the order came for the advance, for as he fell, the one surviving surgeon of the regiment had at once attended to him, had fixed a tourniquet on the stump of his arm, tied the arteries, and roughly bandaged it. Had he not been instantly seen to, he would have bled to death in a few minutes. Dennis now called to one of the parties who were moving about with stretchers. Ralph was lifted onto it and carried to the village of Waterloo, where he was placed in an ambulance wagon, which, as soon as it was full, started for Brussels. The fighting was now over, and Dennis asked leave to accompany his master. The rout of the enemy had been so thorough and complete that it was not thought probable any serious resistance could be offered to the advance of the allied armies to Paris, and he therefore obtained leave without difficulty to remain with his master. Ralph suffered from exhaustion rather than pain on the journey to Brussels, and several times became almost unconscious. At 4 o'clock in the morning the ambulance stopped at a handsome house that its owner had placed at the disposal of the authorities for the use of wounded officers. He was carried upstairs and placed in bed in a room on the second story. Dennis at once proceeded to install himself there as well. He brought down a mattress from a room above, laid it in the corner, throwing his greatcoat over it. Then, as soon as he thought the shops were open, he hurried out and bought a kettle and a saucepan, 2 cups and tumblers, a small basin, and several other articles. "There, your honour," he said as he returned. "Now we've got everything we need. And I can make soups and drinks for your honour, and boil myself a tater without having to go hunting all over the house for the things to do it with." A few minutes later 2 surgeons entered the room and examined Ralph's arm. They agreed at once that it was necessary to amputate it 3 inches higher up. Ralph winced when he heard the news. "It won't hurt you very much," one of the surgeons said. "The nerves are all numbed with the shock they've had, but it's absolutely necessary in order that a neat stump be made of it. The bone is all projecting now, and even if the wound healed over, which I don't think it would, you'd have trouble with it all of your life." "And of course if it must be done, it must," Ralph said. "There isn't much left of it now." "There's not enough to be of much use," the surgeon agreed, "but even a shorter stump that you can fit appliances on to will be a great deal more handy than one with which nothing can be done." The operation was performed at once, and although Ralph had to press his lips hard together to prevent himself from crying out, he did find it less painful than he had expected. "There, you will do now," the surgeon said. "Here, my man, take that basin and a tumbler and run downstairs to the kitchen. They'll give you some broth there, and some weak spirits and water. Bring them up at once." Ralph took a spoonful or 2 of the broth and a sip of the spirits, and then lay back and presently dozed off to sleep. Dennis had followed the surgeons out of the room. "And what instructions is there, your honour?" "Your master is just to be kept quiet. If he's thirsty, give him some lemonade, and you can obtain that or anything else you require below." "And about myself, sir? I wouldn't speak about it, but I've had nothing to eat since yesterday morning, and I don't like leaving Mr. Conway alone even to buy myself a mouthful." "You will not have regular rations, but all officers' servants and orderlies will obtain food below. Meals will be served out at 8 in the morning, 1 and 6. You take down your pannikin and can either eat your food there or bring it up here as you choose. Breakfast will not be ready for 2 hours yet, but there are several others in the same plight as yourself, and you will find plenty to eat below." Dennis took his place by his master's bedside until he saw that he was sound asleep. Then, taking the pannikin from the top of the knapsack, he stole noiselessly out, and in 2 or 3 minutes he returned with the pannikin full of soup, a small loaf, and a ration of wine. "By jabers," he said to himself as he sat down to eat them, "these are good quarters entirely. I should wish for nothing better if it wasn't for the master lying there. Lashings to eat and drink, and a room fit for a king. Nothing to do but to wait upon his honour. I suppose after today I shall be able to stale out for a few minutes sometimes for a draw of me pipe. It would never do to be smoking in here. The master wouldn't mind it, but I expect them doctors would be for sending me back to my regiment if they were to come in and smell it." After he had finished his meal, Dennis took his seat by Ralph's bedside, but he was thoroughly exhausted. He had not slept a wink since the night before the battle, and after the fatigue of the day had been tramping all night by the side of the ambulance, which was constantly stopped by the numerous vehicles that had broken down or had been overturned by the way. After waking up suddenly with a jerk once or twice, he muttered to himself, "I'll just take 5 minutes on the bed, then I shall be all right again," and threw himself down on his mattress with the great coat for a pillow, and slept for several hours. So heavy was his slumber that he was not even roused when the surgeons came round at 10 o'clock to see how Ralph was. He had just woke. "And how do you feel, Mr. Conway?" "Well, I feel quite comfortable," Ralph said, "but shall be glad of a drink. Where is my man?" "He is asleep there in the corner," the surgeon said. "I'll give you a drink of lemonade. The poor fellow is worn out, no doubt." "Oh yes, please don't wake him. I'm glad he is asleep, for he had all that terrible day yesterday, and was on his feet all night. I shan't want anything but this lemonade, and I have no doubt I shall go straight off to sleep again as soon as you have gone." It was not until 1 o'clock that Denis woke. He at once got up and went to Ralph's side. The latter opened his eyes. "How do you feel now, your honour?" "Oh, I'm getting on very well, Denis. My arm hardly hurts me at all at present. I expect it will ache worse presently. I've been having a few minutes' sleep, your honour, and now if you don't want me for a minute I'll run down and see about breakfast. I should think it must be nearly ready." "See about dinner, you mean, Denis? Why, it's just 1 o'clock." "1 o'clock? Why, your honour must be dreaming." "I don't think so, Denis. There is my watch on the table." "Why, your honour does not mean to say," Denis said in great astonishment, "that I've been sleeping for 5 hours? Why, the watch must have gone wrong." "The watch is right enough, Denis. I heard it strike 12 by the church clocks before I dozed off last time. Why, the surgeons came in at 10 o'clock and gave me some lemonade." "And me to know nothing about it. Denis Mulligan, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Sleeping like a pig in a stile, with your master laying wounded there beside you and no one to look after him. Why, I just laid down for a 5-minute nap, your honour, seeing that you'd gone off into a beautiful sleep, and never dreamed of more than that." "That was the best thing you could do, Denis. You had been 24 hours on your feet, and you would have been fit for nothing if you hadn't had a good rest. Now go downstairs and get your dinner, and when you come back again you can bring me up a basin of broth and a piece of bread. I begin to feel hungry, and that's a capital sign, I believe." When Ralph had finished his broth he said to Denis, "I shan't want anything now for some time, Denis. You can put a glass of lemonade within reach of my hand, and then I shall do very well for an hour or two. I'm quite sure he must be dying for a pipe, so go out and take a turn. It'll freshen you up, and you can bring me back what news you can gather as to the losses yesterday, and whether the army started in pursuit of the French." It was some time before Denis would consent to leave the room, but at last, seeing that Ralph really wished it, he went out for an hour and returned full of the rumours he'd picked up of the terrible losses of the British and the utter rout of the French army. The next morning Ralph had a great surprise, for just as he had finished his breakfast there was a tap at the door, and a lady entered. Ralph could hardly believe his eyes as his mother ran forward to the bed, but the pressure of her arms and her kisses soon showed him that it was in fact a reality. "Why, mother darling," he exclaimed, "how on earth did you get here?" "I came across on his smack to Ostend, Ralph, and then came on by carriage. I got here last night and learned at the Quartermaster General's office that you were wounded and were somewhere in Brussels. At least they believed you were here somewhere, but they could not say where. They let me have a copy of the list of the houses that had been allotted for the use of wounded officers. It was too late to begin the search last night, but I've been 3 hours going round this morning. I saw the surgeon downstairs, and he told me," and her lips quivered and her eyes filled with tears, "that I had lost my left arm, Mother. Well, that's nothing to fret about when thousands have been killed. One can do very well without a left arm, and I think on the whole that I've been wonderfully lucky. Denis?" But Denis was not in the room, having, as soon as he had discovered who Ralph's visitor was, gone out to leave them alone. And have you made this journey all by yourself, Mother?" "No, my dear. Mr. Tallboys was good enough to come over to take care of me, by the way." "Mr. Tallboys, Mother? How did he know that you were coming?" "Well, I told him, Ralph. But that's a long story, and you shall hear it another day. The doctor said you had better not do too much talking now. Mr. Tallboys will stay here a day or two and then go on home. I intend to make a room somewhere close by and install myself here as your head nurse." "Oh, I shan't want much nursing, Mother, but I shall be delighted to have you with me. I have a capital servant, the man I told you about in my letters. He's a most amusing fellow and very much attached to me. Do you know he got leave directly the battle was over and was all night walking by the side of the ambulance wagon? He is a capital fellow. By the way, Mother, I suppose the will has not turned up yet? You said in your last letter you had great hopes of its being found." "It has been found, Ralph, and it is all just as we supposed. But how it was found, or anything about it, you mustn't ask at present. It's a long story, and I must insist now that you lie quiet and go to sleep." "Well, I will try, Mother. Will you just look outside the door and see if Denis is there? Denis, this is my mother," he said as the soldier came in. "She's come over to help nurse me, and as she will be principally with me in the daytime, you will be at liberty to go out whenever you like." "Sure, and I'm glad the lady has come, Mr. Conway, though I would have done the best I could for you. Still, a man's but a poor crater in a sick room. Can I get you anything, ma'am?" "Well, I have had nothing this morning, Denis, and if you could get me a cup of tea and some bread and butter, if it's not against the rules, I should be very glad." "Sure, I'll do that, ma'am, with the greatest pleasure in life," Denis said, and presently returned bringing up a tray with tea, bread and butter, and a plate of cold meat. "Is there anything else, ma'am?" "Well, Denis, I should be very much obliged if you will take a note from me to a gentleman named Tallboys, whom you'll find at the Hotel de l'Europe. Give it to him yourself if you can. He'll be glad to hear from you about my son, how he is going on, and so on." For the next few days Ralph's arm was exceedingly painful, attended by a certain amount of fever. At the end of that time he began to improve, and his wound made steady progress toward recovery. After staying for 4 days in Brussels, Mr. Tallboys had returned home. Mrs. Conway and Denis divided the nursing between them, sitting up on alternate nights. A fortnight after Mrs. Conway's arrival, Ralph said, "Now, mother, I shall be up tomorrow, and can therefore be considered as fairly convalescent. So there can be no reason now why you should not tell me the story about the finding of the will. You told me in one of your letters before Christmas that Mr. Tallboys had failed altogether, so how did it come to be found?" Mrs. Conway thereupon told the story. When she came to the point where she had gone as a servant to the Hall, Ralph interrupted her with a loud protest. "I don't like that, mother. I don't like the idea of your having gone as a servant, whatever the stake was. If I had been at home and had known it, I certainly would have not let you go. Not if there had been 10 fortunes to be gained by it. The idea of your having to go and live as a servant and work for people like that is horrid." "There was nothing very unpleasant about it, Ralph. I had plenty to do and to think about, and the time passed a great deal more rapidly than it would have done if I had been staying at home all by myself. It would have been very lonely and dull then, and I can assure you that I considered it no hardship at all being at the Hall. But you must not interrupt me in my story. If you do, I shall tell you nothing more about it until you get home to England." This threat effectually sealed Ralph's lips, and beyond occasional exclamations he said nothing until the story was ended. "Well, it's all very wonderful, mother," he said, "and I should never have thought for a moment that you were so brave, and could have put things together like that, and could have carried out such a scheme. But I'm awfully glad you've succeeded, because you had set your mind on it, and the money will, I hope, make you quite comfortable. How much was it, after all, mother? You never did tell me that." "Well, it's half of Mr. Penfold's estates, and of the money he had invested, which is a very large sum, Ralph, although I do not know how much." "Half the estate? Why, it will make me quite a rich man. I never dreamed it was anything like that. I thought most likely it was enough to continue the allowance that he said he should make me. Why, mother, it's tremendous. And what becomes of the other half?" "That is left to Mabel Withers, Ralph. You two divide everything that he left." "Well, that certainly is rather hard upon his sisters," Ralph said, "and I don't blame them for being against it, though of course it was not right to keep the will hidden. Mr. Penfold did not leave anything to them because they are both very well provided for. Their father left them a handsome sum at his death, and as they have been living at the Hall ever since, and can have spent nothing, they must be very amply provided for. Their brother therefore naturally considered he was perfectly at liberty to leave his property as he chose. I do not think the Miss Penfolds have the slightest reason to grumble, after living as they have done for the last 20 years at their brother's expense." "Of course that does make a difference," Ralph agreed. "It certainly didn't seem nice that Mabel and I, who were no relation by blood to Mr. Penfold, should come into the property that his sisters expected would be theirs. But of course now you explain it, it's different." "I do not think in any case, Ralph, Mr. Penfold would have left his fortune to his sisters. He was a man very averse to exerting his own will, and I am sure that he submitted to rather than liked his sisters' residence at the Hall. I know that he considered, and justly, that they had once committed a cruel wrong upon him, and had in a way spoiled his life. I question whether he really ever forgave them." "I see, mother," Ralph said. "Well, now, about myself, I should think there can be no occasion for me to continue in the army unless I like." "Well, I hope you don't like, Ralph. In the first place, I want to have you with me, and in the second, you'll be a large landowner, and property has its duties." "Well, there's no necessity to decide about that at present. The doctor said yesterday I should certainly get 3 months' sick leave before I rejoined. By all we hear, the fighting is at an end, and there is no fear whatever that Napoleon will have it in his power to cause trouble in the future. They will take care of that, whatever they do with him. If there's going to be peace everywhere, I do not know that I should care very much about staying in the army. But, as I said, we need not decide at present." 10 days later Ralph was so recovered that he was able to return home with his mother. As soon as she informed him of her arrival at Dover, Mr. Tallboys wrote to tell her that he had had an interview in London with the Miss Penfolds' lawyer. who informed him that he had instructions from his clients to examine the will, and, if satisfied of its genuineness, to offer no opposition whatever to its being proved. Mr. Tallboys had thereupon shown him the will, and had no difficulty in convincing him that it was the document he himself had drawn up, and Mr. Penfold had signed in his presence. The lawyer has placed all the deeds and documents relating to Mr. Penfold's property in my hands, and, as I was of course before well aware, my late client died worth a very considerable property, in addition to his large estates in this country. For the last 20 years his income has exceeded his expenditure by an average of £3,000 a year, and as the surpluses have been judiciously invested, and as the prices of all funds and stocks now stand vastly higher than they did during the course of the long war, their total value now amounts to something over £130,000. The property in this country was valued, at the time Mr. Penfold drew up his will, at £80,000. These estates he left to your son, and the sum of £80,000 in various investments to Miss Withers, and directed that the residue, whatever it might be at his death, should be equally divided between them. Your son's share, therefore, will amount to about £25,000. I may say that the outlying farms, which were settled by deed as a security for the £400 annually paid to you, are not included in the above valuation, but are ordered to revert to the main estate upon your decease. The formalities will be completed in the course of a short time. I may say that from the totals to be divided must be deducted legacy duties, which, as your son and Miss Withers are strangers by blood to the testator, will be heavy. Mr. Tallboys added that he heard the younger Miss Penfold was now recovering from her serious illness, but it was not probable that she would ever be again herself. He had received, he said, a letter that morning from their solicitor, saying that as soon as Miss Eleanor Penfold could be moved, which it was hoped would be in the course of another week, the ladies would vacate possession of the Hall. A fortnight later, Mrs. Conway and Ralph left Dover for London, leaving orders with an agent to sell the furniture of their house. All Ralph's old friends on the shore had been made happy with handsome presents. After a short stay in London, they went down, and Ralph took possession of the Hall. He soon found there was abundance of occupation for his time on the estate, and that this would be increased when, as would doubtless be the case, he was placed on the Commission of Peace for the county, as Herbert Penfold had been before him. As soon as Ralph had completely recovered his health and strength, he told his mother that she must spare him for a week, as he had promised that he would, on the first opportunity, go over to Dunkirk to see his friend Jacques. He crossed by the packet from Dover to Calais, and thence by coach to Dunkirk. Here he inquired among the fishermen for Jacques, and found that he had returned before Napoleon broke out from Elba, and that he was owner of a fishing smack which was now at sea. The next day Jacques returned, and his delight at meeting Ralph was unbounded. He took him home to his neat cottage, where his pretty young wife was already installed. Ralph remained 2 days with him, and obtained a promise from him that he would once a year sail over to Weymouth and pay him a visit. "I am a rich man, Jacques, now. At present I see you want nothing, but should any accident befall your fishing boat, or you have need for money for any other cause, write to me, and the money for a new boat or for any other purpose shall be yours at once. I could afford to give you 100 boats without hurting myself, so do not hesitate for a moment in letting me know if I can help you. It will be a real pleasure for me to do so." Jacques kept his promise, and never missed coming over once a year to pay Ralph a visit, and as his 5 sons, one after another, grew up to be able to manage boats for themselves, they were each presented one by Ralph. Jacques himself prospered as a fisherman, and never required the assistance Ralph would have been glad to give him. Neither Ralph nor Mabel Withers was informed of the expression of Mr. Penfold's hopes in his will that they would some day be married, the two mothers agreeing cordially that nothing was so likely to defeat the carrying out of Mr. Penfold's wishes as for the young people to have any suspicions of them. They were still but boy and girl, and were now perfectly happy in their unrestrained intercourse, for not a day passed that the two families did not see something of each other, but had they had a suspicion of the truth it would have rendered them shy and awkward with each other, and have thrown them much more widely apart. "We both hope that it will come about, Mrs. Conway," Mrs. Withers said one day, "and I certainly think there is every prospect of it. Let us leave well enough alone, and allow it to come about naturally and without interference." As soon as Ralph left the army he purchased Dennis Mulligan's discharge, and the Irishman was installed as butler and Ralph's special servant at the Hall, and remained in his service to the end of his life. In due time the natural change in the relations between the two young people came about, and their youthful friendship ripened into love. When Ralph was 23 and Mabel had just come of age, she changed her name and took up her place at the Hall, Mrs. Conway gladly handing over the reins of government to her. She herself lived with her children, for she was almost as fond of Mabel as of Ralph, to the end of a long life, and deep was the regret among her children and grandchildren when she was at last laid to rest in Bilston Church, close to the resting place of Herbert Penfold. End of Chapter 19, The Rout, and end of One of the 28th, by G. A. Henty. Recording by Mike Harris.